Welcome. The night has fallen, the world has gone silent, and now it is just you and my voice. This is NightSleepWhisper. Tonight, we aren't just starting any story. We are beginning a massive, 50-chapter epic that pushes the very boundaries of reality. Together with Detective Arthur, we will walk the dusty corridors of Blackwood Manor, listen to the rhythm of the falling rain, and uncover the shattering secrets hidden behind locked doors. Now, lean back, put on your headphones, and close your eyes. The whispers of Blackwood are waiting for you. If you are ready, let us begin the first chapter. Arthur Vance sat at his desk. The room was small and very quiet. Outside, the sky was dark and heavy with clouds. The rain hit the window glass with a steady rhythm. The street lamps gave a soft orange light to the wet road below. Arthur looked at his old watch. It was late at night, but he did not want to go home yet. He liked the quiet of his office when the city was asleep. The office was filled with the smell of old paper and cold coffee. There were many folders on his desk. Arthur was a private investigator. His job was to find people and solve problems. Usually, his work was about lost cats or missing jewelry. He wanted something more important. He wanted a real mystery. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. It was a firm and fast knock. Arthur stood up and adjusted his blue tie. He walked to the door and opened it. A woman stood in the hallway. She wore a long, dark blue coat. Her hair was very wet from the rain. She looked tired, and her face was pale. Her eyes were wide, and she held her leather bag very tightly against her chest. "Can I help you?" Arthur asked. His voice was calm and kind. The woman stepped into the room. She took off her wet hat and shook it. "Are you Mr. Vance?" "The investigator?" she asked. Her voice was low and thin. "Yes, I am," Arthur answered. "Please, sit down. You look very cold." Arthur walked to the corner of the room. He poured a glass of fresh water and gave it to her. The woman sat in a large, wooden chair across from his desk. She took a small sip of the water. Her hands were shaking. Arthur sat down in his chair and waited. He was a patient man. He knew that worried people needed time to find their words. "My name is Elena," she said at last. "I work for Mr. Henderson. He is a very wealthy man. He lives in a big house in the countryside called Blackwood Manor." Arthur nodded. He knew the name Henderson. Everyone in the city knew the name. Mr. Henderson owned many large factories and successful shops. He was a powerful person. "What is the problem, Elena?" Arthur asked. He picked up a pen and a notebook. Elena looked at the floor. She looked like she wanted to cry, but she stayed strong. "Mr. Henderson is gone," she whispered. "He disappeared 3 nights ago. The police came to the house, but they found nothing. They think he just walked away because he was stressed. But I know him. He did not leave on his own." Arthur leaned forward. This was interesting. "Why do you think that?" he asked. The door to his office was locked from the inside. Elena explained. The windows were also locked. He was inside the room at 10 o'clock. "I saw him there. But at 11 o'clock, the room was empty. He was gone." Arthur felt a small chill in the air. A man disappears from a locked room. It was a classic puzzle. He looked at Elena's worried face. She was truly scared for her boss. "I will help you," Arthur said. "Tell me more about Blackwood Manor." Elena sighed with relief. "Thank you, Mr. Vance. The house is a strange place. It is very old and very big. There are many people there, but no one tells the truth." Arthur leaned back in his chair. He looked at the rain against the window. He wanted to understand the night Mr. Henderson vanished. "Tell me exactly what happened 3 nights ago," He said, "Do not leave out any details. Every small thing is important." Elena took a deep breath. She looked at her hands. It was Tuesday. She began. The weather was not like this. It was a very clear and cold night. Mr. Henderson had a quiet dinner at 7 o'clock. He ate with his brother, Victor. They did not talk much. Victor is often angry about money. Arthur wrote the name Victor in his notebook. Who else was in the house? Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, was in the kitchen. Elena replied. And Mr. Green, the lawyer, was in the library. He had many papers to show Mr. Henderson. After dinner, at 8 o'clock, Mr. Henderson went to his private office. He told us he had a lot of work. He said, "Do not disturb me until tomorrow morning." Did he lock the door? Arthur asked. Yes. Elena said, "I heard the metal bolt slide into place. He always locks his door when he works. It is a very heavy wooden door. It only has one key, and he keeps it in his pocket." Arthur tapped his pen on the desk. "And the windows?" "The office is on the second floor." Elena explained. "The windows are very old. They have heavy iron latches. From the outside, there is only a flat stone wall. There are no trees or pipes to climb." At 10 o'clock, I walked past the office. I saw light under the door. I heard the sound of a page turning. He was definitely inside. What happened at 11 o'clock? Arthur asked. I went to the office to bring him some tea. Elena said. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I called his name. Nothing. I felt a cold wind coming from under the door. That was strange. I called Mr. Green and Victor. We used a spare key to open the door. The bolt was still closed, so we had to push very hard. When the door finally opened, the room was empty. Arthur stared at her. Empty. Was there any sign of a fight? No. Elena shook her head. His glasses were on the desk. His coat was on the chair. The windows were still locked from the inside. The room was cold, but we did not know why. He was just gone. It was like he walked through the walls. Arthur stood up. He walked to the window and looked at the dark street. This was not a simple case of a man running away. A man cannot lock a door and a window from the inside and then disappear. I will go to Blackwood Manor tomorrow morning. Arthur decided. I need to see this room. I also want to talk to Victor and Mr. Green. Elena stood up too. She looked a little better now. Thank you, Mr. Vance. I will tell Mrs. Gable to prepare a room for you. Please be careful. There is a strange feeling in that house. Arthur nodded. I am always careful. Elena, go back now and rest. I will see you tomorrow. The sun did not shine the next morning. Thick, grey clouds covered the sky. Arthur Vance woke up early. He packed a small bag with his clothes, a flashlight, and his notebook. He looked at the map of the countryside. Blackwood Manor was far from the city. It sat in a valley near a dark forest and a cold river. Arthur went to his garage. His car was old but very strong. He started the engine. The car made a low, steady noise in the quiet morning. He drove out of the city. At first, there were many buildings and people. But soon, the tall buildings became small houses. Then, the houses disappeared. There were only fields of brown grass and tall, dark trees. The rain began again. It was not a heavy rain, but it was constant. The water made the road slippery. Arthur drove slowly. He looked at the trees on the side of the road. They had no leaves because it was late autumn. Their branches were long and thin. In the fog, The trees looked like grey ghosts reaching for his car. The wind moved the branches back and forth. Arthur thought about the case. He thought about the locked office. How can a man leave a room if the door and windows are closed? He thought about the people in the house. Elena seemed honest, but she was very scared. Victor wanted money. Mr. Green, the lawyer, was there too. Everyone had a reason to be nervous. The road became narrow and steep. There were no other cars now. The silence of the countryside was very heavy. Arthur turned on the heater in his car, but he still felt a little cold. He saw a sign made of old wood. It said, "Blackwood Village. 5 miles." He passed through the village quickly. It was a very small place. The shops were closed. A few adults walked on the sidewalk with large umbrellas. They did not look at his car. They looked at the ground. It was a lonely place. Finally, Arthur saw a tall stone wall. It was covered in green moss. He followed the wall for a long time. Then, he reached 2 large iron gates. The gates were very high and had sharp points at the top. A small sign on the gate said, "Blackwood Manor. Private property." The gates were closed. Arthur stopped his car and waited. He saw a small camera near the top of the gate. A few moments later, the heavy iron gates began to move. They opened slowly. Arthur drove inside. The driveway was long and filled with grey stones. On both sides of the driveway, the grass was very long. It was not a happy place. It felt like a place that wanted to be left alone. At the end of the road, a very large house appeared through the fog. It was Blackwood Manor. The car stopped in front of the main entrance. Arthur turned off the engine, and suddenly, the world was very quiet. He sat for a moment and looked up. Blackwood Manor was a mountain of grey stone. It had 3 floors and many small, narrow windows. The windows looked like dark eyes watching him. Some of the walls were covered in dry, brown vines. The house did not look friendly. It looked like a place that held many secrets. Arthur opened his car door. The air outside was much colder than in the city. He pulled his coat tight and grabbed his bag. The ground was wet, and the small grey stones on the path made a noise under his boots. He walked toward the massive wooden front door. It was decorated with heavy iron carvings. Before he could knock, the door opened. Elena stood there. She looked even more tired than the night before. She wore a simple black dress and a grey sweater. "Welcome to Blackwood Manor, Mr. Vance," she said. She did not smile. She stepped aside to let him in. Arthur entered the front hall. It was a very large room with a high ceiling. A giant glass lamp hung from the center, but only a few bulbs were lit. The floor was made of black and white marble. On the walls, there were many old paintings of men and women. They all had serious faces and dark clothes. "The house is very quiet," Arthur remarked. His voice echoed in the big space. "It is always quiet now," Elena replied. "Mrs. Gable is in the kitchen. Mr. Victor is in the drawing room, and Mr. Green is in the library. They are waiting to speak with you, but they are not happy about a private investigator being here." Arthur nodded. He expected that. People with secrets usually do not like investigators. He looked at the grand staircase. It was made of dark, polished wood and went up into the shadows of the second floor. "Where is the office?" Arthur asked. "The room where he disappeared." Elena pointed toward the top of the stairs. "It is on the second floor, at the end of the long hallway. But perhaps you want to leave your bag in your room first. I have prepared a guest room for you on the 3rd floor." "Thank you, Elena," Arthur said. "But first, I want to see the family. It is better to meet everyone while the sun is still up." He followed Elena through a set of double doors. They entered a room filled with heavy furniture and a large fireplace. A tall man stood by the window. He was holding a glass of amber liquid. This was Victor Henderson. He looked like his brother, but his face was harder. He turned around and looked at Arthur with cold, blue eyes. "So, you are the man Elena hired," Victor said. His voice was deep and unpleasant. "I hope you are not here to waste our time. My brother is gone, and a detective won't bring him back." Arthur stood his ground. "I am here to find the truth, Mr. Henderson. Sometimes the truth is closer than we think." The drawing room was large, but it felt small because of the heavy furniture. A fire burned in the fireplace, but the air was still cold. Victor Henderson stood by the window. He did not move. He looked like a statue. Arthur watched him for a moment. He saw that Victor was a man of many secrets. "I am not interested in your help, Mr. Vance," Victor said. He did not look at Arthur. He looked at the rain outside. "My brother is gone. The police searched every inch of this house. They found nothing. What can a private investigator do that the police cannot? Sometimes, a fresh pair of eyes sees what others miss." Arthur replied. He kept his voice steady and professional. Before Victor could answer, the door at the back of the room opened. A woman walked in. She was very tall and very thin. Her hair was silver and pulled back into a tight, neat bun. She wore a long black dress that reached the floor. She carried a silver tray with a white teapot and 3 small cups. This was Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper. Mrs. Gable did not look at Arthur. She walked to a small table near the fire. She moved slowly and carefully. She placed the tray on the table. She began to pour the tea. The steam rose in the cold air. "Mrs. Gable," Victor said. "This is the man Elena hired. He is a detective from the city." Mrs. Gable stopped pouring the tea. She turned her head slowly and looked at Arthur. Her eyes were a pale, sharp gray. They were like pieces of ice. She did not smile. She did not say hello. "We do not need more people in this house," Mrs. Gable said. Her voice was dry and hard. "This house is already full of shadows. A detective will only bring more trouble. I am only here to find Mr. Henderson," Arthur said politely. "I am sure you want him to return home safely." Mrs. Gable looked at the teapot again. Safety is a word for people who do not live in Blackwood Manor. She whispered, "The master is gone. He belongs to the house now. You should leave before the storm gets worse, Mr. Vance. The roads are dangerous, and the house does not like visitors." She finished pouring the tea and handed a cup to Victor. She did not offer a cup to Arthur. She picked up the empty tray and walked toward the door. Her movements were silent. She was like a ghost moving through the room. "She has worked here for 30 years," Victor said after she left. He took a sip of his tea. "She knows every corner of this place. She thinks the house is alive. She is an old, strange woman, but she is loyal to my brother." Arthur watched the door where Mrs. Gable disappeared. He did not think she was just a strange woman. He thought she was a woman who was protecting something. He looked at his notebook. He had met the brother, the assistant, and the housekeeper. The mystery of Blackwood Manor was just beginning. Elena led Arthur up the grand staircase. The wooden steps were dark and polished. On the second floor, the hallway was very long. There were many doors, but they were all closed. The carpet under their feet was thick and red. It made their footsteps very quiet. At the end of the hall, there was a single door. It was larger than the others. "This is the office," Elena said. She took a heavy silver key from her pocket. She put the key into the lock. The lock turned slowly. She pushed the door open. but she did not go inside. She stood in the hallway and waited. Arthur stepped into the room. He stopped immediately. The air in the office was very cold. It was much colder than the hallway. He could see his own breath in the air. He looked around. The room was beautiful but very serious. There were tall shelves filled with thousands of books. A large desk made of dark oak sat in the middle of the room. A green lamp stood on the desk. Everything is exactly as it was. Elena whispered from the door. We did not move anything. The police looked at everything, but they did not change the room. Arthur walked to the desk. He saw a pair of gold glasses. They were resting on an open book. Next to the glasses, there was a fountain pen and a bottle of blue ink. A half-finished cup of coffee sat on a small coaster. The coffee was now black and cold. Mr. Henderson was sitting here. Arthur asked. Yes. Elena replied. He was reading his reports. He was a very busy man. Arthur moved to the windows. There were 2 large windows behind the desk. He checked the latches. They were made of heavy iron. He tried to pull them, but they were locked tight. He looked down. The ground was far below. There was no balcony. There was only the flat stone wall of the manor. The door was locked from the inside. Arthur said to himself, the windows were locked from the inside. There are no secret panels in the walls. The police searched for secret doors. Elena said. They tapped on every wall. They moved the bookshelves. They found nothing. It is a solid stone room. Arthur knelt on the floor. He looked at the heavy rug under the desk. He felt the cold air again. It was strange. The heater in the room was working, but the center of the office felt like a refrigerator. He moved his hand near the floor. He wanted to find a draft or a hole, but the floor was solid wood. He stood up and looked at the ceiling. There was a large, dark painting of a stormy sea above the fireplace. The eyes of the people in the painting seemed to follow him. Arthur felt a small shiver. He was a man of logic, but this room felt wrong. It felt like the room was hiding the man. I need to stay here for a while. Arthur said. I want to look at his papers. I want to see what he was reading before he disappeared. Elena nodded. I will leave you now, Mr. Vance. If you need anything, I will be in the kitchen with Mrs. Gable. Arthur watched her leave. He was now alone in the locked room. He sat in Mr. Henderson's chair. It was a large, comfortable chair, but Arthur did not feel relaxed. He felt like someone was watching him from the shadows of the bookshelves. Arthur sat in the large office chair. The leather was cold against his back. He looked at the desk again. He saw the papers, the pen, and the cold coffee. Everything looked like a normal workday. But Mr. Henderson was not there. Arthur stood up and took his flashlight from his pocket. He turned it on. A bright beam of light cut through the shadows of the room. He began to walk slowly around the office. He looked at the floorboards. He looked behind the heavy columns of curtains. He moved the small trash can. It was empty. Then, he moved to the desk. It was a very heavy piece of furniture made of dark oak. Arthur knelt on the floor and looked under the desk. The light from his flashlight hit the dark wood. At first, he saw only dust. But then, something small and bright reflected the light. It was near the back leg of the desk. Arthur reached out his hand. He had to stretch his arm far under the wood. His fingers touched something hard and cold. He pulled it out and held it in his palm. It was a small, silver button. Arthur held the button close to the flashlight. It was very beautiful and shiny. It had a small design on it. The design looked like a bird with long wings. Arthur looked at the jacket on the chair. It was Mr. Henderson's jacket. He checked the buttons on the jacket. They were large, black, and made of plain plastic. This silver button did not belong to Mr. Henderson. This is interesting, Arthur said to himself. His voice sounded loud in the quiet room. He thought about the people in the house. Elena wore a simple dress with no buttons. Victor Henderson wore a suit, but his buttons were brown and made of wood. Mrs. Gable wore a black dress with no jewelry or bright buttons. The button was clean. It was not dusty. This meant it was not under the desk for a long time. It fell there recently. Perhaps it fell during the night Mr. Henderson disappeared. Arthur put the silver button into a small plastic bag. He put the bag into his pocket. He looked around the room again. The cold air was still there. He felt a draft of wind near his ankles. He moved his flashlight to the bottom of the wall. He saw the heavy wooden baseboard. There was a tiny gap between the wood and the floor. He touched the gap. The air coming from it was freezing. It was not a normal draft from a window. It felt like air from deep underground. Arthur stood up. He knew there was more to this room than the police found. He needed to find out who wore silver buttons with bird designs. He also needed to know why the air was so cold in a room with no open windows. Arthur left the cold office and closed the door. He turned the silver key in the lock. The hallway was dark, but he could see a light coming from under a door at the far end. He walked toward it. This was the library. He pushed the door open slowly. The library was a massive room. The walls were covered from floor to ceiling with books of every color. In the center of the room, there was a large table made of glass and metal. A man sat there. He was surrounded by tall piles of white papers and thick legal folders. This was Mr. Green, the family lawyer. Mr. Green was a small, thin man. He wore a very expensive dark suit and a crisp white shirt. His glasses were thick, and they made his eyes look very large. He did not notice Arthur at first. He was looking at a gold watch on his wrist. He looked at the watch, then at the door, then back at the watch. He looked very nervous. "Mr. Green," Arthur said. The lawyer jumped in his chair. He accidentally pushed a pile of papers, and they slid across the table. "Oh, you scared me," Mr. Green said. His voice was high and tight. He stood up and tried to fix his tie, but his hands were shaking. "You must be the investigator. Elena told me about you." "I am Arthur Vance," Arthur said. He walked into the room and looked at the papers on the table. "You seem very busy, Mr. Green. Are those all for Mr. Henderson?" "Yes, yes," Green replied quickly. He began to gather the papers into a messy pile. Business does not stop just because a man disappears. There are contracts, taxes, and the will. There is always the will. Arthur sat in a chair across from the lawyer. He noticed that Mr. Green's suit had dark plastic buttons. They were not silver, and they did not have a bird design. "Where were you the night Mr. Henderson vanished?" Arthur asked. Mr. Green sat down again. He looked at his watch again. "I was right here. I stayed in this library all night. I had to finish a very important merger for the company. I did not leave this room until I heard Elena and Victor shouting in the hallway." "Did you hear anything strange before that?" Arthur asked. "A door closing? A voice?" Mr. Green shook his head. "No, nothing. This house has very thick walls. You cannot hear much from the library." He paused and wiped sweat from his forehead with a white handkerchief. "Mr. Vance, do you think he is dead? If he is dead, things will become very complicated. Very complicated indeed." "I don't know yet," Arthur said. He watched the lawyer closely. Mr. Green was too nervous. He acted like a man who was waiting for a bomb to explode. "Why do you keep looking at your watch, Mr. Green?" Are you expecting someone? Mr. Green pulled his sleeve down to hide the watch. No. No. I'm just a man who likes to stay on schedule. Time is money, Mr. Vance. And right now, we are losing both. Arthur stood up. He did not believe the lawyer. Mr. Green was hiding something behind those big glasses and piles of paper. I will let you get back to your work, Arthur said. But stay in the house. I might have more questions later. As Arthur left the library, he looked back. Mr. Green was already looking at his watch again. The dining room was the largest room Arthur saw so far. A long table of dark, polished wood stood in the center. High above, a heavy crystal lamp gave a dim, yellow light. The walls were covered with dark red paper. It felt like eating inside a large, old box. Arthur sat at one end of the table. Victor sat at the other end. Elena and Mr. Green sat on the sides. They were all very quiet. The only sound was the wind outside and the soft movement of people in their chairs. The silver spoons made a quiet sound against the porcelain plates. Mrs. Gable entered the room. She carried a large bowl of hot soup. She moved around the table and filled their bowls. She did not speak. She did not even look at the guests. When she finished, she walked back to the kitchen and closed the heavy door. The room felt even colder after she left. The soup is cold, Victor said. He pushed his plate away. He looked at Arthur with a hard expression. Is this how you spend your time, Mr. Vance? Eating our food and looking at our walls? I'm learning about this house, Arthur replied calmly. He took a small spoonful of the soup. It was not cold, but it had a very strange, bitter taste. A house tells a story, Mr. Henderson. I just need to listen. Mr. Green did not look up from his bowl. He used his white napkin to wipe his mouth every few seconds. His hands were still shaking, and he accidentally knocked his spoon onto the floor. The sound of the metal hitting the wood was very sharp in the quiet room. He picked it up quickly, his face turning red. We are all very tired, Elena said softly. She looked at Victor. Mr. Vance is here to help us. We should be kind. Victor laughed, but it was a dry and unpleasant sound. Kindness does not find missing people, Elena. Money finds people. Or perhaps the police find them. But a man with a notebook? I doubt it. Arthur ignored the insult. He looked at Mr. Green's sleeves. He looked for silver buttons. He saw only plain, black ones. He looked at Victor's sleeves. Again, no silver. He wondered where the button under the desk came from. It was a small piece of a much larger puzzle. The meal continued in heavy silence. The room was too big for only 4 people. The shadows in the corners seemed to grow longer as the candles on the table burned down. Arthur felt that everyone at the table was holding a different secret. They did not look at each other. They only looked at their plates or at the dark, reflectionless windows. When the dinner ended, nobody stayed to talk. Victor stood up and walked away without a word. Mr. Green followed him quickly, clutching his briefcase. Elena stayed for a moment, her eyes full of worry. I hope you found something today, she whispered. I found a few things, Arthur said, but I need to see more. He watched her leave the room. The large dining room was now empty. Arthur felt a heavy weight in the air, a feeling of deep unease. He knew the night was just beginning. Arthur Vance sat on the edge of the bed in his guest room. The room was on the 3rd floor, high above the rest of the house. It was a cold room with a very high ceiling. The walls were covered in dark green paper that looked almost black in the dim light of his small bedside lamp. Outside, the wind moved the branches of the tall trees. They hit the stone walls of the manor with a soft, steady rhythm. Arthur did not feel like sleeping. His mind was full of questions. He took the small plastic bag from his pocket. He held the silver button up to the light. The bird with the long wings looked back at him. It was a beautiful object, but it felt out of place in this dark, dusty house. Who wore such a button? And why was it under the desk in a locked room? The house was very quiet now. Everyone was in their own rooms. But the silence of Blackwood Manor was not a peaceful silence. It was a heavy, waiting silence. Arthur turned off his lamp. He wanted to listen to the house. He sat in the darkness for a long time. His eyes became used to the shadows. Suddenly, he heard something. It was not the wind or the rain. It was a heavy, scraping sound. It came from the hallway right outside his door. It sounded like a very large and heavy object was moving across the wooden floor. The sound was slow and steady. Arthur stood up quickly. He did not turn on the light. He grabbed his metal flashlight but did not switch it on yet. He walked to the door on his tiptoes. He did not want his boots to make a sound on the floorboards. He put his ear against the cold wood of the door. The scraping sound stopped. For a moment, there was total silence. Then, there was a dull thud, as if something heavy hit the floor. Arthur felt a small vibration under his feet. He waited for a few seconds, breathing slowly. Then, he grabbed the door handle and turned it. He pushed the door open and stepped into the hallway. He turned on his flashlight. The bright beam of light shot across the long, narrow hall. At first, he saw nothing but empty space and closed doors. But then, he moved the light to the left. A large, wooden chest sat in the middle of the hallway. Arthur remembered seeing that chest earlier. It was a very old, heavy box made of dark oak with iron locks. Before, it was against the wall near the stairs. Now, it was 5 meters away from its original place. It was sitting directly in front of a small, narrow door that Arthur had not noticed before. Arthur walked toward the chest. He looked at the floor. He saw deep scratches in the polished wood. Someone, or something, had pushed this heavy chest across the floor. He looked at the narrow door behind the chest. It was made of the same dark wood as the walls. It had no handle, only a small keyhole. He looked around the hallway. It was empty. There was no one in sight. The air in the hallway felt very cold, just like the air in the office downstairs. Arthur reached out and touched the top of the wooden chest. It was freezing to the touch. He felt a shiver go down his back. Someone was moving heavy furniture in the middle of the night, but the hallway was a dead end. There was nowhere for a person to run. Arthur stood very still. His heart was beating fast. He looked at the heavy wooden chest in the middle of the hallway. It was cold, like ice from a winter lake. He did not understand how a person could move such a heavy object without making a lot of noise. The scratches on the floor were fresh. The wood was white where the heavy box had scraped away the dark polish. He moved his flashlight slowly. The beam of light traveled down the long, narrow hallway. The walls were covered in old portraits of the Henderson family. Their eyes seemed to watch him in the dark. At the very end of the hall, near the large window, Arthur saw something. A tall, dark shape moved. It was not a person he could see clearly. It was a shadow, darker than the darkness around it. The shape was very tall, almost reaching the top of the door frame. It stood perfectly still for 1 second. Arthur frozen, his breath caught in his throat. Then, the shadow turned and moved around the corner of the hallway. It moved with a strange, flowing motion, like water. "Wait!" Arthur called out. His voice was a loud whisper in the dead of night. He did not wait. He ran down the hallway. He did not care about the noise of his boots now. He reached the corner where the shadow had disappeared. He turned the corner quickly, holding his flashlight out like a weapon. The hallway was empty. Arthur stopped. He breathed heavily. This part of the hallway was a dead end. There were only 2 doors here, and both were closed. He walked to the first door and turned the handle. It was locked. He went to the second door. It was also locked. He looked at the floor, but there were no carpets here to show footprints. There were no windows in this part of the hall. Where did you go? Arthur asked the empty air. He felt a sudden, sharp drop in the temperature. The air was not just cold, it was freezing. He looked at his hands and saw that his skin was pale. He held his flashlight up to the ceiling. There were no holes or vents. He looked at the walls. They were solid stone and wood. Arthur walked back to the heavy chest. He looked at the small, narrow door behind it. He tried to push the chest back to its original place, but it did not move. He put his shoulder against the wood and pushed with all his strength. The chest stayed exactly where it was. It felt like it was bolted to the floor, yet someone had just moved it 5 meters. He took out his notebook and wrote down what he saw. Tall shadow. Moving furniture. Freezing air. He thought about Victor Henderson. Victor was a tall man, but he was heavy. He could not move that fast or that quietly. He thought about Mr. Green. The lawyer was too small and weak to move a chest like this. Arthur looked at the small door again. There was no handle, only a tiny, old keyhole. He reached into his pocket and touched the silver button he found in the office. Was the shadow wearing silver buttons? He did not know. The shadow was too dark to see any details. He decided to go back to his room, but he did not sleep. He sat in the chair by the door and watched the hallway through the small gap under his door. He stayed awake until the first light of morning touched the grey sky. The morning sun was weak and pale. It did not bring much light into the dark corners of Blackwood Manor. Arthur washed his face with cold water and went downstairs. He was very tired, but his mind was sharp. He needed to find answers about the moving chest and the shadow in the hall. He walked into the dining room. The smell of strong coffee filled the air. Victor Henderson was already there. He sat at the head of the long table. He was not eating. He held a thick stack of papers in his large hands. His face was red, and he looked very angry. When he saw Arthur, he slammed the papers down on the table. The sound was like a heavy book hitting the floor. "You!" Victor shouted. His voice was loud and rough. "Why are you still walking around my house? I told you yesterday that we do not need you here." Arthur did not get angry. He walked to the table and poured himself a cup of black coffee. "I am here because Elena asked for my help," Arthur said quietly. "And I am here because a man is missing from a locked room. Don't you want to find your brother, Victor?" Victor stood up quickly. He was a tall, heavy man. He walked over to Arthur and stood very close. Arthur could see the lines of anger on his face. "My brother was a weak man," Victor said. "He spent all his time with books and old papers. He did not know how to run a business. This house and the family money belong to someone who is strong." "Do they belong to you?" Arthur asked. He looked directly into Victor's eyes. "I am his only brother," Victor replied. He pointed to the papers on the table. "These are the legal documents. If Thomas is dead, everything comes to me. The factories, the shops, and this manor. I am the rightful owner of the Henderson name." Arthur looked at Victor's clothes. He wore a dark green hunting jacket. The buttons were made of brown wood. They were not silver. They did not have a bird design. Arthur thought about the shadow he saw last night. Victor was tall enough to be the shadow, but Victor was a loud and heavy man. The shadow in the hall moved like a ghost. "You seem very interested in the inheritance, Mr. Henderson," Arthur remarked. "Did you and your brother argue about money before he disappeared?" Victor's eyes narrowed. He stepped even closer to Arthur. "What happened between me and my brother is none of your business. You are a small man with a small job. Do not ask me questions about my family." Victor grabbed his papers and walked toward the door. He stopped and turned around. "I am going to the village to meet with the local police. I want them to tell you to leave. If you are still here when I come back, I will throw you out myself." He left the room and closed the door with a powerful force. The glass in the windows shook from the movement. Arthur sat down and took a sip of his coffee. He was not afraid of Victor's threats. In fact, Victor's anger made Arthur more curious. A man who is angry often has something to hide. Arthur watched Victor leave the room. The house felt a little more peaceful without him, but the tension remained. Arthur finished his coffee and stood up. He decided to go back to the library. If Mr. Green was busy with papers, perhaps the books themselves had a story to tell. He walked through the cold hallways until he reached the heavy double doors of the library. The library was a magnificent room, but it felt forgotten. Thousands of books lined the walls from the floor to the very high ceiling. The air was thick with the smell of old leather and dry paper. Dust danced in the thin beams of light that came through the tall, narrow windows. There was no one inside. Mr. Green was gone, leaving only a few neat piles of paper on the central table. Arthur began to walk along the shelves. He ran his fingers over the spines of the books. Some were bound in red leather, others in dark green or black. He looked for anything that seemed unusual. He remembered the silver button with the bird design. He looked for books about birds or nature, but he found nothing that matched the design. He moved to the back of the room, where the shadows were darkest. Here, the books were very old and covered in a thick layer of grey dust. Arthur used his flashlight to see the titles. Most were about law, history, or land ownership. Then, he stopped. He noticed something strange on the middle shelf. One book was not sitting perfectly straight. It was a thick, black book with no title on the spine. It was pulled out just a few centimeters further than the other books. Arthur reached out and touched it. The leather felt cold and slightly damp. He pulled the book toward him. As he pulled the book, he expected it to come off the shelf. Instead, he heard a heavy, mechanical sound behind the wall. It was the sound of metal gears turning against stone. The bookshelf did not move, but a small wooden panel near the floor slid open. It was a hidden compartment, no larger than a showbox. Arthur knelt on the floor. He shone his light into the small space. Inside, there was a single object. It was an old, leather-bound journal. He picked it up carefully. The cover was worn, and the edges of the pages were yellow. He opened the first page. The handwriting was neat and small. Property of Thomas Henderson. It said, "Personal notes. Do not read." Arthur felt a spark of excitement. This was a private diary. He turned the pages quickly. He saw dates from many years ago, but the last few pages were recent. The last entry was dated the night of the disappearance. The entry was short. It said, "They are watching me. I can feel the cold again. The bird is in the cage, but the door is not locked. I must hide the new will before Green finds it." Arthur stared at the words. Mr. Henderson was afraid. He knew someone was watching him, and he mentioned a bird and a new will. Arthur thought about the silver button again. Was the bird on the button the same bird from the diary? He closed the journal and hid it inside his coat. He heard footsteps in the hallway and stood up quickly. He had to be fast. The secrets of Blackwood Manor were starting to come into the light. Arthur left the library quickly. He kept one hand on his coat to hide the secret journal. He did not see anyone in the hallway, but he felt many eyes on his back. He walked to the heavy front door and stepped outside. The rain was light, but the mist was very thick. It moved across the grass like a slow, grey river. The gardens of Blackwood Manor were not beautiful. They were wild and dark. The grass was long and wet. There were many old rose bushes, but they had no flowers. Only long, sharp thorns grew on the black branches. Arthur walked along a path made of broken grey stones. He wanted to clear his head and think about the journal. He heard a rhythmic sound coming from behind a row of tall, thin trees. Arthur followed the noise. He found a man digging a hole near the edge of the woods. The man was very old. He wore a heavy brown coat that was covered in dark mud. A flat cap hid his eyes, but Arthur could see his long, white beard. This was Silas, the gardener. "Good morning," Arthur said. The old man did not stop digging. He pushed the metal shovel into the ground with his heavy boot. Silas threw a pile of dirt to the side. He waited for a few seconds. Then he looked up. His face was full of deep lines, like the bark of an old tree. "There are no good mornings at Blackwood Manor," Silas said. His voice was like stones rubbing together. "Only grey mornings and black nights. I am Arthur Vance. I am looking for Mr. Henderson," Arthur explained. Silas leaned on his shovel. He looked at the large house in the distance. "Many people look for things in this place. Most of them find nothing but trouble. You should not be out here in the rain, city man. The air here is not healthy." "I noticed the house is very cold," Arthur said. "Even with the fires burning. Do you know why?" Silas laughed, but he did not smile. It was a dry, unhappy sound. "The cold does not come from the wind. It comes from the stone. This house is cursed, Mr. Vance. It was built on bad ground many years ago. It is a hungry house. Sometimes, it takes people. It took the master's father, and now it has taken the master." Arthur stepped closer. "What do you mean by cursed?" Silas pointed his dirty finger at the manor. "The Hendersons think they own the land, but the land owns them. There are secrets under the floors and behind the walls. When the Master Thomas started looking for the old papers, the house got angry. I told him to stop. I told him to leave the past alone." "Did you see anything strange on Tuesday night?" Arthur asked. Silas picked up his shovel again. "I saw the fog. The fog was thick and white. It climbed the walls of the house like a ghost. I heard a bird cry out in the dark, and then everything went silent. That is all I know." The old man turned away and started digging again. He did not want to talk anymore. Arthur watched him for a moment. Silas was a strange man, but he seemed to believe what he said. Arthur felt the cold wind on his neck and walked back toward the house. He needed to read the journal in private. Arthur walked away from Silas. The old gardener went back to his work, and the sound of the shovel hitting the earth grew faint. Arthur followed a small, narrow path that led toward the back of the garden. Here, the grass was even longer, reaching his knees. The trees were thick and grew close together. Their branches created a dark roof above his head. The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and old wood. As he walked, the mist became thicker. It was hard to see more than a few meters in front of him. Arthur moved slowly, using his hands to push away the cold, wet branches. Suddenly, the trees opened up into a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a structure made of heavy, grey stones. It was the old well. The well was very ancient. The stones were covered in thick green moss and small, pale mushrooms. A wooden roof sat on top of the stones, but the wood was rotting and black. A heavy iron chain hung from a beam, disappearing into the dark circle of the well. There was no bucket. The chain just hung there, perfectly still. Arthur approached the well carefully. He looked at the ground. Because of the constant rain, the earth around the well was a sea of dark, thick mud. He knelt down and turned on his flashlight. The bright light showed something important. There were footprints in the mud. The footprints were fresh. They were not filled with water yet, which meant someone stood here very recently, perhaps only an hour ago. Arthur studied the marks. They were large, clearly from a man's heavy boots. The footprints came from the direction of the manor, circled the well once, and then led toward the dense woods at the edge of the property. Arthur measured the size of the prints with his hand. They were much larger than his own. They looked like the size of Victor Henderson's boots. But as he looked closer, he noticed something strange. The right footprint was deeper than the left one. This person was carrying something very heavy, or perhaps they had a limp. He stood up and looked into the well. He shone his flashlight down into the darkness. The stone walls of the well were wet and slippery. Deep at the bottom, he saw the reflection of his light in the black water. The water was not still. Small circles moved across the surface, as if something had just been dropped inside. Arthur leaned over the edge. He did not hear anything except the quiet drip of water. Then, he smelled something. It was not the smell of fresh rain or old stone. It was a sharp, chemical smell, like the cleaning fluid used in hospitals. It was very faint, but it was there. Who was here? Arthur whispered. He looked toward the woods where the footprints disappeared. The trees were silent and dark. He felt a cold shiver. Someone was moving around the grounds of Blackwood Manor, away from the eyes of the other guests. He took a photo of the footprints with his small camera and marked the location in his notebook. He needed to get back to the house and find Elena. He had many questions about the people who visited the manor. Arthur returned to the manor. He left his muddy boots by the large front door. The house felt very heavy and still. He walked through the long hallway toward the small morning room. He saw Elena there. She sat in a small chair near a window. She was not reading or working. She was simply staring at the grey fog outside. She looked very small in the big, dark house. Elena, Arthur said softly. She jumped in her chair. She put her hand over her heart and looked at him. Mr. Vance. You are back. You are very wet from the rain. I am fine. Arthur replied. He walked closer and sat in a chair across from her. He looked at her tired eyes. I found something by the old well. I found footprints. And I have something else to show you. Arthur reached into his pocket. He pulled out the small plastic bag with the silver button. He held it up so the light hit the bird design. Elena leaned forward. Her eyes grew wide, and she stopped breathing for a second. She reached out her hand, then pulled it back quickly. Do you recognize this button, Elena? Arthur asked. His voice was calm but firm. Elena looked at the door to the hallway. She wanted to make sure no one was listening. Then, she looked back at Arthur. Yes. She whispered. I know that button. It does not belong to Victor or Mr. Green. It belongs to a man named Julian. He is a very private person. He visited Mr. Henderson 2 weeks ago. Who is Julian? Arthur asked. He opened his notebook and wrote the name down. He is an old business partner. Elena explained. She began to twist a piece of her hair with her fingers. But they are not partners anymore. They had a very bad argument many years ago. When Julian came here 2 weeks ago, Mr. Henderson was very upset. He did not want Julian in the house. They went into the office and closed the door. Arthur leaned in. Did you hear what they said? Elena nodded slowly. I was in the hallway. I heard shouting. Mr. Henderson said, I will not give it to you. It is not yours. Julian was very angry. He said, the bird belongs in its cage. Thomas, do not make me come back for it. Arthur thought about the diary entry. The bird is in the cage, but the door is not locked. What is the bird? Elena. Is it a piece of jewelry? A painting? I don't know. Elena said. She looked like she wanted to cry. But there is something else. Mr. Vance. I did not tell the police the whole truth. On the night Mr. Henderson disappeared, I heard something. It was at 10:30. What did you hear? I heard a man's voice in the office. Elena whispered. It was not Mr. Henderson's voice. It was a deep, cold voice. But the door was locked. I was too scared to knock. I thought I was imagining things. But now, with the button, I think Julian was in that room. Arthur looked at the silver button. A visitor from the past, a secret argument, and a locked room. The puzzle was becoming more complex. Thank you for telling me. Elena. This is very important. Does Julian live nearby? He has a house near the river. She said. But he is a dangerous man. Mr. Vance. Please, be careful. Arthur left Elena in the morning room. He had a new name now. Julian. He needed to find out if the lawyer, Mr. Green, knew this man. Arthur walked toward the study. The study was a smaller room next to the library. It was where Mr. Green kept his extra files and his personal things. The door to the study was not closed. It was open just a few centimeters. Arthur stopped and listened. He did not hear any voices. He did not hear the sound of a pen on paper. He pushed the door open very slowly. The room was empty. A single lamp was on, casting a warm light over a small wooden desk. On top of the desk sat a black leather briefcase. It was Mr. Green's bag. It was very expensive and had shiny gold locks. One of the locks was open. Arthur knew he should not look inside another man's bag. But Mr. Henderson was missing. In a mystery, every bag can hold a secret. Arthur walked to the desk. He looked at the hallway one last time to make sure no one was coming. Then, he opened the briefcase fully. Inside, there were many neat piles of white paper. Most of them were tax documents and bank reports. But at the very bottom, Arthur found a thick brown envelope. The envelope was different. It had a large, bright red stamp on the front. The stamp said, "Urgent and private." Arthur pulled out the papers from inside the envelope. His eyes moved quickly over the words. It was a legal contract. But it was not about Mr. Henderson's factories. The contract was between Mr. Green and Julian. Arthur's heart beat faster. According to the document, Mr. Green owed Julian a large amount of money. The date on the paper was from last month. At the bottom of the page, there was a special note written in red ink. It said that if the debt was not paid soon, Julian would take control of the Blackwood Manor land. So, the lawyer is in trouble. Arthur whispered to himself. He realized that Mr. Green had a very strong reason to want Mr. Henderson to disappear. If Mr. Henderson was gone, Mr. Green could perhaps change the will or sell the land to pay his own debt. This was a very big clue. Mr. Green was not just a nervous lawyer. He was a man with a dangerous secret. Suddenly, Arthur heard a heavy sound in the hallway. It was the sound of leather shoes hitting the floor. Someone was coming toward the study. Arthur quickly put the papers back into the brown envelope. He slid the envelope into the briefcase and closed the lid. He moved away from the desk and stood by the bookshelf. The door opened fully. Mr. Green walked in. He was holding a glass of water, and his face was very pale. When he saw Arthur standing there, he nearly dropped his glass. The water splashed a little onto his shiny shoes. "Mr. Vance!" Green cried out. His voice was high and shaky. "What are you doing in my study? This is a private room. I was looking for you, Mr. Green." Arthur said calmly. He did not show any guilt. "I wanted to ask you about a man named Julian. Do you know him?" Mr. Green's face went from pale to a strange, sickly green color. He looked at his briefcase on the desk, then back at Arthur. He gripped his glass of water so tightly that his knuckles turned white. I have no idea who that is." Mr. Green lied. "Now, please leave. I have a lot of work to do." Arthur did not move. He stood near the bookshelf and watched Mr. Green. The lawyer was very nervous. Outside, the wind became much stronger. It was not just a light rain anymore. A heavy storm was hitting the old stone walls of Blackwood Manor. The tall trees in the garden swayed back and forth. Their branches looked like long fingers scratching the window glass. "I think you are lying, Mr. Green," Arthur said. His voice was very quiet. "I think you know Julian very well. In fact, I think you owe him a lot of money." Mr. Green opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked like a fish out of water. Suddenly, a bright flash of lightning lit up the room. For a second, everything was white and sharp. Then, a very loud sound of thunder shook the entire house. The floor under Arthur's boots vibrated. Then, the lights flickered. The yellow glow of the lamp on the desk became dim. It turned bright again, then dim once more. Finally, with a small popping sound from the ceiling, the light went out. The electricity was gone. The room was now in total darkness. "Help!" Mr. Green cried. His glass of water hit the floor. The sound of breaking glass was sharp in the dark room. "I cannot see. Where are you?" Arthur did not panic. He was a man who worked in the dark many times. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his metal flashlight. He pushed the power button, but nothing happened. He shook the flashlight and pushed the button again. It stayed dark. This was strange. He had put new batteries in the flashlight only yesterday. "My flashlight is not working," Arthur said. He felt a sudden, strange coldness in the air. It was the same freezing air from the office and the hallway. It was like a door to a winter night had opened inside the room. He heard the sound of a door opening. It was not the main door to the study. It was a smaller, softer sound, like wood sliding against wood. "Mr. Green, stay where you are," Arthur commanded. He moved his hand along the wall. He found the edge of the desk. He reached out to find the lawyer, but his hand touched only empty air. He moved his hand further across the desk. He felt the cold wood, but the briefcase was gone. Mr. Green's heavy leather bag was no longer on the table. "Mr. Green," Arthur called out again. There was no answer. The only sound was the heavy rain against the roof and the wind in the chimney. Arthur took a deep breath. He reached into his other pocket and found a box of matches. He struck a match against the side of the box. The small, orange flame was tiny, but it was enough to see. The room was empty. Mr. Green was gone. The briefcase was gone. Even the chair where the lawyer sat was pushed back and empty. Arthur looked at the floor. He saw the broken glass from the water cup. He also saw a small piece of paper that was not there before. The match burned Arthur's fingers, and he dropped it. The darkness returned. He was alone in the study, and a freezing wind was blowing through the room. Arthur's fingers burned as the match reached the end. He struck a second match quickly. The orange light danced on the walls, creating long, jumping shadows. He reached down and picked up the small piece of paper he saw on the floor. It was a white scrap with 3 numbers written in black ink. 10, 25, 40. A combination. Arthur whispered to himself. He looked at the wall opposite the desk. There was a large, heavy painting in a gold frame. It showed a dark, winter forest. The trees in the painting looked exactly like the trees outside the manor. Arthur moved toward it. He pushed the side of the heavy frame. To his surprise, the painting moved easily on its hinges like a small door. Behind the painting, there was a square iron door. It was a wall safe. Arthur used the light of the match to look closer. The safe was already open. The heavy metal door hung halfway open, revealing the dark space inside. Arthur felt the metal with his fingers. It was as cold as the air in the office. He reached inside the dark hole. His hand moved around the cold interior, but he felt only hard metal and a little bit of dust. Empty, he said. This was the place where Mr. Henderson kept his most important documents. Elena had mentioned a will. If the safe was open and empty, the will was gone. Did Mr. Green take it when the lights went out? Or was it already gone before the storm started? The match went out, and the darkness returned. Arthur stood perfectly still. He heard a soft sound from the hallway. It was the sound of a heavy door closing far away. He did not have his flashlight, and he only had a few matches left in the box. He felt his way to the door of the study, keeping one hand on the cold wooden furniture. The hallway was a long tunnel of blackness. "Mr. Green," Arthur called out. There was no reply. The house felt like it was breathing. The wind in the chimney made a low, mourning sound that echoed through the rooms. Arthur realized that the power outage was probably not an accident. Someone wanted the lights to go out. Someone wanted to move through the manor without being seen. He thought about the numbers on the paper. 10, 25, 40. If the safe was already open, why was the combination on the floor? Perhaps the person who opened the safe was in a great hurry. Perhaps they dropped the paper when they heard Arthur enter the room. Arthur walked slowly down the hallway, keeping his hand on the wall to guide him. He needed to find a candle or a better light. He needed to find the other adults in the house. The missing will was a dangerous thing. In a house full of people who wanted money, a missing will was a clear reason for a crime. He reached the top of the stairs. Far below, in the kitchen area, he saw a tiny yellow light. It was the light of a single candle. It was moving. Arthur walked down the stairs very slowly. The house was a sea of black ink. Without the electric lights, the halls felt even larger and colder. He kept his left hand on the wooden railing. He reached the bottom of the stairs and turned toward the back of the house. The tiny yellow light of the candle was now closer. It was coming from the kitchen at the end of a narrow hallway. Just as Arthur reached the kitchen door, he heard a sudden, sharp noise. It was the sound of a heavy ceramic object hitting the stone floor and breaking into 100 pieces. The sound was very loud in the quiet house. Arthur pushed the kitchen door open and stepped inside. The kitchen was a large room with a high ceiling. In the middle of the room stood a long wooden table. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, was standing next to it. She held a small, silver candle holder. The flame of the candle jumped and moved in the air. Her face was extremely pale, and her thin hands were shaking so much that the candle almost fell. On the floor near her feet, a large white dinner plate lay in many small, sharp pieces. Mrs. Gable did not seem to notice Arthur at first. She was staring at the heavy wooden door that led out to the back garden. The door was slightly open, and the cold wind was blowing into the kitchen. "Mrs. Gable," Arthur said. He kept his voice low so he would not scare her. The old woman jumped and looked at him. Her grey eyes were wide with fear. She dropped the candle holder onto the table, but the flame stayed alive. She grabbed her chest with her hand and took a deep, shaky breath. "Oh, Mr. Vance," she whispered. Her voice was very thin and weak. "You scared me. I thought you were someone else." Arthur walked closer to her. He looked at the broken plate and then at the open door. "What happened here? Why are you in the kitchen in the dark?" I came down to get some matches, Mrs. Gable explained. Her voice was still trembling. The power went out, and I did not want to be in my room without a light. But when I entered the kitchen, I saw something. I saw a man standing by that window. Arthur looked at the window. It was dark and wet from the rain. Was it Mr. Green? Or Victor? Mrs. Gable shook her head slowly. No, it was not them. It was a tall man in a dark coat. He looked just like the master. He looked just like Mr. Henderson. He was standing there, watching me. When I saw him, I dropped my plate. Then he turned around and walked out into the rain. Arthur went to the back door. He pushed it open and looked out into the garden. The rain was falling hard, and the mist was very thick. He could not see any movement. He looked down at the floor near the door. There was a single, wet footprint on the clean stone. It was a large footprint, just like the ones he saw by the old well. "Stay here, Mrs. Gable," Arthur said. "Lock the door and do not let anyone in. I'm going to find the others." He realized the mystery was changing. If Mrs. Gable was right, Mr. Henderson was not missing. He was outside, hiding in the dark. But why would a wealthy man hide in the rain on his own land? Arthur left the kitchen. He held a small candle in his hand. The flame was tiny, but it helped him see the floor. He did not go outside into the rain yet. He wanted to look at the top of the house first. If a man was watching the house from outside, maybe he was also hiding inside the high rooms of the manor. He walked up the grand staircase. Then he walked up the smaller stairs to the third floor. At the end of the dark hallway, he saw a very small, narrow door. It was painted the same dark color as the wall. He pushed the door. It did not move at first. He pushed harder with his shoulder. The door opened with a heavy, scraping sound. Behind the door was a set of wooden stairs. They were very steep and thin. Arthur climbed them slowly. Each step he took made a loud noise in the quiet house. The air became even colder as he went higher. Finally, he reached the top. He was in the attic. The attic was a very large space directly under the roof. The ceiling was low and slanted. Huge wooden beams crossed the room like giant ribs. Arthur held his candle high. The light showed a thick layer of grey dust on everything. The dust was like a soft, grey carpet on the floor. It was perfect for an investigator. If someone walked here, they would leave a clear mark. Arthur looked at the floor. He did not see any fresh footprints in the dust. This part of the house was truly empty and silent. He walked further into the room. There were many old things here. He saw tall wooden chairs with broken legs. He saw large mirrors covered in grey sheets. The sheets looked like white ghosts in the flickering candlelight. In the corner, he found a row of old clothes. They were hanging from a metal rod. There were long black coats, heavy wool sweaters, and old-fashioned hats. Arthur touched one of the coats. It was very cold and smelled like dry earth and old paper. He moved the clothes aside. Behind the clothes, he found a large wooden trunk. It sat under a small, circular window. The window was dirty, but the lightning outside made the glass flash with a white light every few seconds. The trunk was strange. Unlike the chairs and the mirrors, the trunk was not covered in dust. The top of the trunk was clean and shiny. Someone had touched it very recently. Arthur knelt on the dusty floor. He put his candle on a flat box next to him. He tried to lift the lid of the trunk. It was very heavy and made of dark metal and thick wood. He pulled with all his strength. The lid opened slowly with a long, complaining sound from the metal hinges. Inside, there were no gold coins or jewels. There were only stacks of old letters and a single, heavy object wrapped in a blue cloth. Arthur reached for the object. His heart beat faster. Just then, A strong wind hit the roof of the house. The candle flame flickered and went out. Arthur was in total darkness again, deep inside the attic of Blackwood Manor. Arthur stood in the pitch-black attic. He could not see his own hands. The wind screamed against the roof, and the old wood groaned around him. He reached into his pocket and felt for his box of matches. His fingers were cold and stiff. He found a match and struck it against the side of the box. A small, orange light appeared. It was tiny, but it was enough to see the trunk in front of him. He reached into the trunk and picked up the object wrapped in blue cloth. It was heavy and rectangular. He carefully unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a silver picture frame. The silver was dark with age, but the glass was clean. Arthur held the match closer to the frame. Inside the frame was an old, black and white photograph. It showed 3 men standing in front of Blackwood Manor. The sun was shining in the picture, and the grass was short and neat. Arthur recognized the man in the middle immediately. It was a younger Mr. Henderson. He looked happy and was smiling at the camera. To his left stood Victor. He was younger too, but his face was already serious and hard. Arthur looked at the third man on the right. He was tall and thin with very dark hair. He had a small, sharp scar on his chin. Arthur stared at the man's face. He knew those eyes. He remembered driving through the village the day before. He remembered seeing a man standing outside the village post office. That man was older now, and his hair was grey, but the eyes and the scar were the same. Marcus. Arthur whispered. He turned the frame over. On the back of the photo, someone had written a short note in blue ink. Thomas, Victor, and Marcus, the 3 kings of Blackwood. July 2006. Arthur's match burned down to his fingers. He dropped it and quickly struck another one. He looked at the other things in the trunk. There were letters tied with a red string. He picked up the top letter. It was addressed to Thomas Henderson, but the return address was a house in the village. The name on the envelope was Marcus Thorne. Arthur realized that Marcus Thorne was not just a stranger from the village. He was a man who used to be close to the Henderson family. Why was he not at the manor now? And why was his photo hidden in a trunk in the dusty attic? Suddenly, the floorboards behind Arthur made a loud, cracking noise. It was the sound of someone stepping on old wood. Arthur froze. He did not turn around. He held the match high. The light was small, but he saw a long, thin shadow move across the dusty floor. Someone else was in the attic with him. The person did not speak. Arthur heard the sound of slow, heavy breathing. The air in the attic became freezing cold. The match in Arthur's hand flickered and went out. In the total darkness, he heard the sound of a door closing softly. Arthur waited in the dark attic for a long time. He did not move. He listened to the wind and the rain. He did not hear the breathing anymore. He struck another match, but the attic was empty. The person was gone. Arthur quickly put the old photo and the letters into his coat. He hurried down the narrow stairs and returned to the main part of the house. The power was still out. The hallways were black and silent. Arthur decided to go back outside. He wanted to see if anyone was moving in the gardens. He walked to the heavy front door and stepped into the cold night. The rain was hitting the stone walls of the manor with a loud, rhythmic sound. He walked past the tall, dark trees. Suddenly, a hand grabbed his arm. It was a strong, rough hand. Arthur turned quickly, ready to defend himself. He saw a pale face in the darkness. It was Silas, the gardener. Silas was wearing a long, wet coat. His eyes were wide and full of fear. "You must leave this place, Mr. Vance," Silas whispered. His voice was shaking. "The storm is getting worse. The river is rising. Soon, the bridge to the village will be under water. I cannot leave yet." Silas. Arthur said. I found a photo in the attic. Who is Marcus Thorne? Silas froze. He looked around at the dark trees as if the trees were listening. He pulled Arthur closer to the wall of the house. Do not say that name here. Silas hissed. Marcus was the third brother. But he was not a Henderson. He was a cousin. There was a big fight many years ago. It was about the land and the money. Marcus lost everything. Where is he now? Arthur asked. He lives in the village. Silas replied. But people say he never left the manor in his heart. He watches the house from the woods. I saw him tonight. Mr. Vance. I saw him standing near the old well. He was looking at the windows of the office. Arthur thought about the footprints he saw earlier. They were large, just like the ones Silas might make, or a man like Marcus. Is he dangerous? Silas. The next big storm is coming tonight. Silas said, ignoring the question. The house gets angry when the family fights. If you are still here when the bridge breaks, you will be trapped. And the shadows in this house do not like trapped men. Silas let go of Arthur's arm and disappeared into the grey mist of the garden. Arthur stood alone in the rain. He felt the weight of the photo in his pocket. The mystery was no longer just about a missing man. It was about a family war that started 20 years ago. Arthur looked up at the dark windows of the manor. He knew he had to stay, even if the bridge broke. Arthur returned to the house. His coat was heavy with rainwater. He stood in the kitchen and listened. The house was silent, but he felt a strange vibration under his feet. He remembered the freezing air in the office and the hallway. He also remembered the sound of heavy furniture moving. All these things felt like they were connected to the ground below the manor. He found the door to the cellar behind a narrow wooden panel in the kitchen pantry. The door was small and had no window. Arthur pushed it open. A cloud of cold, damp air hit his face. It smelled like wet stone and very old dust. He struck a match and began to walk down the stairs. The stairs were made of heavy grey stone. They were uneven and slippery. Arthur held onto the cold stone wall as he went deeper into the earth. The light from his match was small, but he could see that the cellar was very large. It was divided into many small rooms with arched ceilings. He reached the bottom of the stairs. The floor was made of dirt and flat stones. In the first room, there were hundreds of glass bottles on tall wooden racks. They were covered in thick white spiderwebs. Arthur walked past them. He moved into the second room. This room was filled with old garden tools and broken chairs. He walked to the very back of the cellar. The air here was the coldest he had felt yet. He saw a small wooden table standing against the far wall. On top of the table sat a small box. It was made of dark, heavy wood. It was not dusty like the rest of the cellar. It looked clean, as if someone had placed it there very recently. Arthur moved closer. He held his match near the box. The box was decorated with silver metal on the corners. In the center of the lid, there was a small carving of a bird with long wings. It was the same design as the silver button in his pocket. The bird in the cage. Arthur whispered. He tried to lift the lid, but it did not move. There was a heavy iron lock on the front of the box. He needed a key. He looked around the small table. He moved a few old rags and a broken clay pot. Then, he saw something shining near the back of the table. It was a heavy iron key. It was attached to a piece of dirty red string. Arthur picked it up. The metal was freezing, almost like a piece of ice. He put the key into the lock of the wooden box. He turned it slowly. He heard a sharp clicking sound as the lock opened. Arthur's heart beat fast. He prepared to open the lid. But then, he heard a sound from the stairs. It was the sound of a heavy boot hitting the stone step. Then another step. Someone was coming down into the cellar. Arthur quickly blew out his match. He grabbed the box and the key and hid in the shadows behind a large wooden barrel. The darkness was total. He waited, holding his breath, as the footsteps came closer and closer. Arthur pressed his back against the cold, damp stone wall. He held the small wooden box tightly against his chest. The footsteps on the cellar stairs were heavy and slow. Each sound echoed in the underground room. A thin beam of light appeared at the top of the stairs. It moved across the dusty floor, hitting the old wine bottles and the broken chairs. The person carrying the light reached the bottom of the stairs. Arthur could see the shape of a tall man in a long coat. The man stopped near the table where the box had been. He moved his light around the empty surface. He let out a low, angry growl. Then, he turned and walked back up the stairs quickly. Arthur waited for 5 minutes in the dark. When he was sure the man was gone, he climbed the stairs and returned to the kitchen. The power was still out, but the sky was turning a pale, sickly grey. Morning was coming, but the storm was not over. He walked into the main hall and stopped. The heavy front door was wide open. The wind was blowing rain onto the black and white marble floor. Standing in the middle of the hall was a woman. She was not Elena or Mrs. Gable. She was younger, with long dark hair and a bright red coat that looked very expensive. She was carrying a small leather suitcase. "Can I help you?" Arthur asked, stepping into the light of the doorway. The woman turned around. She looked surprised, but she did not look scared. Her eyes were sharp and intelligent. "I'm looking for Thomas Henderson," she said. Her voice was clear and confident. "I am his daughter, Claire." Arthur blinked. His daughter. Elena did not mention a daughter. Neither did Victor. Claire laughed, but there was no joy in it. Of course they didn't. Victor hates me because he wants the money for himself. And Elena, well, Elena is just a worker. She doesn't know everything about this family. "I am Arthur Vance. I am a private investigator," Arthur said. He looked at her wet coat. "How did you get here?" Silas said the bridge was dangerous. "I drove across just before the water got too high," Claire replied. She walked toward the fireplace, though there was no fire. "I am here because my father sent me a letter 2 weeks ago. He said he was in danger. He said he needed to see me immediately to talk about his will." Arthur thought about the empty safe and the missing papers. He thought about the man he just saw in the cellar. "Your father disappeared 3 nights ago, Claire. He was in a locked room." Claire did not cry. She simply nodded. "I knew something was wrong. This house has always been full of people who want things that don't belong to them. Where is my Uncle Victor? I need to speak with him." "He is likely in the drawing room," Arthur said. He watched her closely. She was very calm for someone whose father was missing. He wondered if she was telling the truth, or if she was just another person coming to Blackwood Manor to claim a piece of the Henderson fortune. Arthur watched Claire walk toward the drawing room. She was very calm. Too calm for a daughter with a missing father. He decided to find Mr. Green first. The lawyer was the key to the legal side of this mystery. Arthur found him in the study again. The lights were back on now, but they were very dim. The storm outside made the electricity weak. Mr. Green was sitting at the desk. He was not working. He was staring at the wall. His face was very white. When Arthur entered, the lawyer pulled his sleeves down over his wrists. He looked like he wanted to hide his hands. "Mr. Green," Arthur said. He walked to the desk and sat down. "We need to talk about the will. And we need to talk about Claire." Mr. Green jumped. He looked at the door. "Claire. She is here." I told her not to come. It is too dangerous. Why is it dangerous? Arthur asked. And why did you tell me there was no one else in the family? You said Victor was the only brother. You did not mention a daughter. Mr. Green wiped his forehead with a blue handkerchief. His hands were shaking very badly. I forgot. It was a long time ago. Mr. Henderson and Claire did not speak for many years. She is not in the old will. She is not part of the inheritance. Arthur leaned forward. He looked into the lawyer's large eyes behind the thick glasses. But there is a new will, isn't there? The one Mr. Henderson wrote 2 weeks ago. The one you and Julian are looking for. The lawyer's face changed. He looked terrified. I don't know what you are talking about. There is only one will. It is in the safe. The safe is empty, Mr. Green. Arthur said. His voice was hard. I saw it. I also saw the combination on the floor. 10, 25, 40. You opened that safe, didn't you? You opened it when the lights went out. Mr. Green stood up quickly. He tried to walk to the door, but Arthur stood in his way. The lawyer began to speak very fast. His story was changing every second. No. I didn't open it. It was Victor. Or maybe it was Elena. I was just looking for a candle. I saw the safe was already open. I didn't take anything. You are lying. Arthur said. You owe Julian a lot of money. If the new will exists, it probably gives everything to Claire or a charity. If the new will disappears, the old one stays. And in the old one, maybe you get a big piece of the money. Mr. Green sank back into his chair. He looked like a small, broken bird. He did not look at Arthur. He looked at his own shaking hands. You don't understand. He whispered. Julian is not a man you say no to. He is coming here. Mr. Vance. He is coming for his money. And if he doesn't find that paper, no one is safe. Arthur stood up. He had enough information for now. The lawyer was trapped by his own greed and fear. Arthur left the room, but he kept the silver key in his pocket. He needed to find out what was in the locked box from the cellar. Arthur retreated to his room on the 3rd floor. He locked the door and pushed a heavy chair against it. He didn't trust anyone in Blackwood Manor, not the angry brother, the nervous lawyer, or even the surprised daughter. He placed the small wooden box on his bed. The silver bird on the lid seemed to glow in the dim, flickering light of his last candle. He took the freezing iron key from his pocket. His heart hammered against his ribs as he inserted it into the lock. The sound was sharp, like a bone snapping. Arthur lifted the lid slowly. Inside the box, there were no jewels or gold. Instead, there was a single, thick envelope made of yellowed parchment and a heavy, brass object shaped like a bird's claw. Arthur picked up the envelope first. It was sealed with red wax, stamped with the same bird design. He broke the seal and pulled out a document. It was the new will. Arthur's eyes scanned the elegant, shaky handwriting of Thomas Henderson. The words confirmed his suspicions. I, Thomas Henderson, being of sound mind but in great fear for my life, hereby revoke all previous wills. To my brother, Victor, I leave nothing but the memory of his greed. To my lawyer, Silas Green, I leave only the debt he brought upon himself. To my daughter, Claire, I leave the entirety of the Henderson estate, including Blackwood Manor and all its secrets. But there was more. A second piece of paper fell out of the envelope. It was a hand-drawn map of the manor's 2nd floor, specifically, the office. Arthur studied it closely. There was a dotted line leading from the large fireplace to a space behind the bookshelves. It was labeled the Bird's Path. A secret passage. Arthur whispered. This explained everything. The locked room wasn't locked to someone who knew the house's hidden architecture. The freezing air wasn't a ghost. It was a draft from the stone tunnels built into the very foundations of the manor. Thomas Henderson hadn't been taken from the room. He had walked out through the wall. Suddenly, a heavy blow struck Arthur's bedroom door. The wood groaned, and the chair he had placed against it slid a few centimeters. "Vance, open this door." It was Victor's voice, loud and full of rage. "I know you were in the cellar. I know you have the box. Give it to me now, or I'll break this door down." Arthur looked at the map, then at the brass bird's claw. He realized the claw wasn't just a decoration. It was a key for the bird's path. He looked at the window. The storm was screaming, and the rain was a wall of water. He couldn't go out the door, and he couldn't stay in the room. He moved to the fireplace in his own room. He felt around the cold stones, searching for a lever or a hidden switch. If there was a passage in the office, perhaps there was one here, too. The door shook again. A loud crack echoed through the room as the wood began to splinter near the top hinge. Victor was a strong man, and his anger was giving him the power of a sledgehammer. Arthur knew he had less than a minute before the chair gave way and the door burst open. He knelt inside the cold fireplace. He ignored the soot staining his sleeves. He ran his fingers along the jagged edges of the inner stone wall. His heart raced. "There has to be a trigger," he muttered. He looked at the brass bird's claw in his hand. It wasn't just a heavy object. It was a tool. On the right side of the chimney, about 30 centimeters up, he found a small, circular indentation in the mortar. It was shaped exactly like the base of the brass claw. Arthur pressed the claw into the hole and twisted it to the right. A heavy stone slab at the back of the fireplace slid inward, then rotated slowly on a central axis. A gust of freezing, stale air hit Arthur in the face. It smelled of wet earth and ancient iron. He grabbed the wooden box and the map, then squeezed through the narrow opening just as the bedroom door finally exploded inward. "Vance, I know you're in here." Victor's roar was cut off as the stone door swung shut, clicking back into place. Arthur was now in total darkness. He struck a match. The tiny flame revealed a narrow stone staircase that spiraled downward into the very heart of the manor. The walls were dripping with condensation, and the steps were dangerously slick. This was the bird's path. He descended carefully. The deeper he went, the louder the sound of the storm became. But it wasn't coming from above. It was a low, booming sound, like waves hitting a cave. After 50 steps, the stairs ended at a small wooden landing. Arthur looked through a tiny slit in the wood. He realized he was looking into the back of the office. He could see the desk, the cold coffee, and the empty chair. But from this side of the wall, he saw something the police had missed. There was a second lever here, hidden behind a false book on the shelf. He didn't stop in the office. The map showed the path continued further down, beneath the cellar, toward the river. He followed the passage until the stone turned into natural rock. The air was saltier here. At the end of the tunnel, he saw a flickering light. It wasn't a candle or a flashlight. It was the orange glow of a small campfire. Arthur stepped out into a large natural cavern hidden beneath the cliffs of the manor. Sitting by the fire, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, was a man. He was thin, his hair was white, and his eyes were tired but sharp. I wondered how long it would take a man of your reputation to find the key. "Mr. Vance," the man said. Arthur lowered his guard. "Mr. Henderson, I presume. Thomas will do." The man replied, coughing softly. "And I see you have my box. I hope you haven't told my brother. Victor has a very short temper when it comes to losing money." Arthur sat on a cold stone ledge across from Thomas Henderson. The fire crackled, sending orange sparks upward toward the jagged ceiling of the cavern. Outside the mouth of the cave, the sound of the Atlantic Ocean crashing against the cliffs was a constant, low thunder. "You look surprised, Mr. Vance," Thomas said, pulling his blanket tighter. "Most people expect a ghost or a corpse. I am neither, though I am certainly tired of this damp air." "How did you do it?" Arthur asked, placing the wooden box between them. The door was locked from the inside. The windows were bolted. "I checked every inch of that office." Thomas smiled weakly. "The Henderson family has lived on this cliff for 300 years. My great-grandfather was a smuggler. He didn't trust banks or governments. He built the Bird's Path, a network of passages hidden within the double-thick stone walls. The entrance in the office is behind the third bookshelf. It's balanced on a counterweight. If you know where to press, the entire shelf rotates. It makes a slight draft. That's the cold air you felt. And the night you vanished, I heard Victor and Green arguing in the hall about the debt to Julian." Thomas explained. "They thought I was sleeping. Green was planning to misplace my heart medication. I realized then that I wasn't safe in my own bed. I took the new will, entered the passage, and came here. I've been waiting for someone I could trust to find the box." Arthur looked at the silver button in his pocket. "I found this in the office. Elena said it belongs to a man named Julian. Was he in the room with you?" Thomas's expression darkened. "Julian Thorne. My cousin Marcus's son. He's been trying to reclaim this land for a decade. He wasn't in the room, but he has been stalking the grounds. Marcus has been helping me. He's the shadow you saw in the hall. He's been moving furniture to block doors and keep Victor away from the secret entrances." "So Marcus is the one who moved the chest on the third floor?" Arthur asked. "Yes." Thomas nodded. "He was trying to protect the passage that leads to the attic. But we are running out of time. Mr. Vance, Julian is not coming alone. He has bought the local police and half the village. If he gets his hands on that will, he'll burn it, and Victor will sign the land over to him just to stay out of prison for his debts." Arthur thought about Claire, the woman in the red coat. "What about your daughter?" "She arrived this morning." Thomas froze. His eyes widened with a sudden, sharp terror. "Daughter?" "Mr. Vance, I don't have a daughter. My wife and I were never able to have children. My only heir is the charity mentioned in that will." Arthur felt a cold drop of sweat run down his spine. If Claire wasn't the daughter, then who was the woman in the red coat currently sitting in the drawing room with Victor? "She has a key to the front door," Arthur whispered. "Then she is with Julian," Thomas said, standing up with difficulty. "And if she's in the house, it means the three kings are about to lose their crown. We have to get back up there. Mr. Vance. Now." A sudden sound echoed from the stone staircase behind them. It wasn't the wind. It was the rhythmic sound of expensive heels hitting the stone steps. The sound of the high heels stopped just outside the circle of firelight. Arthur stood up, keeping himself between the stairs and the frail Mr. Henderson. He gripped the heavy brass bird's claw. It was the only weapon he had. The shadows on the cavern wall danced wildly as a figure stepped into the orange glow. It was Claire, but the expensive red coat was gone. She now wore a tactical black jacket and trousers. The daughterly warmth in her eyes had been replaced by a cold, calculating stare. In her right hand, she held a small, silver-plated pistol. It looked like a toy, but Arthur knew better. That was a very long walk. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice smooth and devoid of any emotion. "And quite damp. I hope what's in that box is worth the ruin of my favorite shoes." "You have excellent timing," Arthur remarked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline. "Though your acting could use some work." Mr. Henderson here tells me he's never seen you before in his life. I assume Claire isn't your real name." "My name is Lydia," she replied, tilting her head toward Thomas. "And I'm a professional closer. Julian Thorne is a man of limited patience, and he's tired of waiting for his inheritance. Give me the box, and maybe I'll let you both walk out of here before the tide rises." A professional closer. Arthur thought. The kind of person who makes sure the loose ends of a family dispute are tied up permanently. The will gives everything to a charity. "Lydia," Arthur said, holding the box tighter, "if you kill us, you still don't have a legal document that helps Julian. You need Thomas alive to sign the land over." "Actually," a new voice boomed from the darkness of the tunnel, "I only need his signature on a very specific set of transfer papers. And with the right encouragement, I think Thomas will be very cooperative." A man stepped out from behind Lydia. He was younger than Thomas, with the same sharp Henderson jawline but eyes that were full of a hungry, restless energy. This was Julian Thorne. He wore a tailored suit that looked wildly out of place in a damp sea cave. "Julian," Thomas whispered, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and pity. "Your father, Marcus, is still alive. He's upstairs. He doesn't want this for you. My father is a ghost haunting a house that threw him out." Julian spat. "I'm not interested in haunting anything. I'm interested in owning it. Now, Mr. Vance, the box. If you hand it over, I might let you keep your life. I hear you're quite good at your job. It would be a shame to end such a promising career in a hole in the ground." Arthur looked at the mouth of the cave. The waves were getting closer. The bird's path was about to be flooded by the rising tide. He looked at the brass claw in his hand. He realized the path didn't just go up and down. According to the map he had memorized, there was a third trigger in this very cavern, one meant for emergencies. "You want the box?" Arthur asked, a small, witty smile playing on his lips. "Catch." Instead of handing it over, Arthur threw the heavy wooden box directly at the campfire. The wooden box tumbled through the air, hitting the center of the campfire. Ash and orange embers exploded into the air, momentarily blinding Lydia and Julian. "No!" Julian screamed, lunging toward the flames. He didn't care about the heat. He cared about the millions of dollars represented by those papers. Lydia raised her pistol, her eyes narrowing as she tried to track Arthur through the swirling smoke. But Arthur wasn't standing still. He dove to the left, toward a large, jagged rock shaped like, of course, a bird's beak. It was the third trigger from the map. "Thomas, get down!" Arthur yelled. He jammed the brass bird's claw into a deep crack in the rock and pulled with every ounce of his strength. There was a sickening groan of shifting stone, followed by the sound of a heavy iron chain snapping deep within the cave walls. A massive wooden gate, hidden behind a false rock face at the mouth of the cave, dropped with the force of a falling guillotine. But it didn't block the water out. It changed the flow of the incoming tide. Instead of gently rising, the sea was funneled into a narrow stone channel that ran directly under the bird's path staircase. The cavern began to fill rapidly. The fire hissed and died, plunged into darkness. "The stairs!" Julian shouted, his voice cracking with panic. He abandoned the box, which was now bobbing in the rising freezing water. "Lydia, get to the stairs." But the bird's path was now a waterfall. The water Arthur had diverted was pouring down the steps from the upper levels, meeting the sea in a chaotic swirl of foam and salt. Lydia fired a shot into the dark, the flash of the muzzle briefly illuminating her terrified face. But the bullet hit only stone. Arthur grabbed Thomas by the arm. "There's a secondary exit. The smuggler's crawl. It leads to the cliffs." I can't climb that. Vance." Thomas gasped, the cold water already up to his waist. "You don't have to climb. You just have to hold on." Arthur pointed to a small iron ring trapdoor set high in the cave wall, accessible only by a set of recessed iron rungs. Arthur boosted the older man up. Thomas grabbed the first rung with a strength born of pure desperation. As Arthur climbed up behind him, he looked back. Julian was struggling in the dark, chest deep in the water, reaching blindly for the floating wooden box. Lydia was gone, perhaps washed back into the tunnel or out to sea. "Leave it, Julian," Arthur called out, though his voice was nearly drowned out by the roar of the ocean. "The box is empty. I have the will in my coat." Julian froze. He looked up, his face pale and twisted in the moonlight filtering through the sea gate. He realized he had been tricked. The box he had risked everything for was just a decoy. Arthur pushed Thomas through the trapdoor into a narrow, dry tunnel. As he scrambled in after him, he looked down one last time. The cavern was almost entirely submerged. Blackwood Manor was reclaiming its secrets, and the sea was finishing what the family's greed had started. The smuggler's crawl was a tight, muddy squeeze, but it eventually opened into a hollowed-out thicket of gorse bushes near the old well. Arthur and Thomas collapsed onto the wet grass, gasping for air. The storm had finally broken. The heavy clouds were splitting apart to reveal the first thin, cold streaks of a lavender dawn. "We made it," Thomas wheezed, looking back at the silhouette of the manor. "Not quite yet," Arthur replied, pulling the dry, yellowed envelope from the waterproof inner pocket of his coat. "We still have a house full of people who think you're a ghost." They walked slowly toward the front entrance. The grand doors were still hanging open, the marble floor inside slick with rainwater. In the dining room, Victor and Mr. Green were sitting in stunned silence. They looked like men who had lost everything. When Arthur and Thomas stepped into the light, Victor let out a strangled cry and fell backward out of his chair. "Thomas!" Victor gasped, his face turning a sickly shade of grey. You were in the room." "The door was locked." "A locked door is only a wall to those who don't know the house, brother," Thomas said, his voice regaining its strength. Arthur stepped forward and placed the new will on the table. "Mr. Green, I believe you'll find this document quite legal. It revokes the old inheritance. Victor, you'll be leaving Blackwood today. And Mr. Green, I suggest you find a very good lawyer of your own. Julian Thorne won't be coming to collect his debt. He and his daughter are currently being detained by the Coast Guard near the cliff caves." The realization hit them like a physical blow. Victor looked at the paper, then at the brother he had tried to replace, and finally at the floor. He didn't say a word. He knew the game was over. As the morning sun finally hit the windows, the cold that had plagued the house seemed to lift. Without the secret vents of the bird's path being manipulated to scare the inhabitants, the manor felt like a normal, albeit very old, building. Arthur walked out onto the porch to find Marcus Thorne, the shadow, waiting by the gate. The old man nodded once to Arthur, a silent thank you for saving his cousin, before disappearing into the morning mist. Elena came out to the porch, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "Is it over, Mr. Vance?" "The mystery is," Arthur said, lighting a cigarette and watching the smoke curl into the crisp air. "The Hendersons have a lot of talking to do, but the bird in the cage is finally free." "And your fee?" she asked with a small smile. "I'll send an invoice," Arthur replied, tipping his hat. "But I think I'll add a small charge for the dry cleaning. Sea caves and silk linings don't mix well." As Arthur drove his small car across the bridge, which was just barely clearing the receding floodwaters, he looked back in the rearview mirror. Blackwood Manor stood tall on its cliff, no longer a place of dark secrets, but a house finally standing in the light. The kitchen was the only room in the manor that felt remotely human this morning. Mrs. Gable was busy at the stove, The smell of frying bacon and strong coffee cut through the lingering scent of ozone and sea salt. Arthur sat at the small wooden servants' table, his damp coat hanging over a chair near the hearth. His muscles ached, and his lungs still felt heavy from the salt spray of the cavern. Thomas Henderson sat opposite him, looking older than he had in the cave. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind a frail man who seemed dwarfed by the massive inheritance he had just reclaimed. "You should be in bed, Thomas," Arthur said, wrapping his hands around a hot mug. "The doctor from the village will be here as soon as the bridge is fully cleared. I've spent enough time hiding in the dark, Mr. Vance," Thomas replied, his voice a raspy whisper. "Besides, there is the matter of the third king. Marcus didn't just help me hide. He gave me something before Julian arrived. Something he found in the deep foundation of the West Wing." Arthur paused, his mug halfway to his lips. "I thought the mystery ended with the will." "The will settles the money," Thomas said, leaning in. "But Blackwood wasn't built for money. It was built for a secret that the Hendersons have been guarding since the 1700s. Marcus found the iron ledger in a part of the tunnel that hasn't been opened in a century. It's not about land or bank accounts. It's a list, Mr. Vance. A list of names." "Names of what?" "People who disappeared," Mrs. Gable interrupted, setting a plate of eggs down. "My grandmother was a maid here. She used to say the stones of Blackwood were thirsty. Every 50 years, the house takes someone. Not a Henderson, but someone close to them. A guest, a servant, a rival." Arthur felt a familiar prickle at the back of his neck. This was no longer a simple case of corporate greed. "And who is the next name on that list?" "Thomas." Thomas reached into his sweater and pulled out a small, soot-stained book bound in rusted iron. He slid it across the table. The metal was cold, even in the warmth of the kitchen. Arthur flipped to the very last page. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was unmistakably fresh, as if the house itself had written it. There, at the bottom of a long column of names dating back centuries, was a single entry: Arthur Vance. Arthur stared at the page. The date written next to his name was today's date, March 5th, 2026. "I think Julian and Lydia were just the beginning," Thomas whispered. "The house didn't want the will found because the will means I stay. And as long as a Henderson stays, the cycle continues. You interfered with the hunger of this place, Arthur." Suddenly, the heavy kitchen door swung open. It wasn't Victor or Elena. It was a man in a grey suit, looking perfectly dry and remarkably calm despite the storm. He held a silver briefcase and wore a small, silver pin on his lapel, a bird with its wings clipped. "Good morning," the man said, his voice as smooth as polished stone. "I am from the Foundation. We've been waiting a long time for someone to open the iron ledger." The man in the grey suit did not wait to be invited. He pulled out a chair next to the hearth, adjusted the crease in his trousers, and sat with a practiced elegance that made the rustic kitchen feel like a high-stakes boardroom. His silver briefcase clicked as he set it on the table, the sound echoing sharply against the stone floor. "My name is Sterling," the man said, his eyes scanning the iron ledger with a hungry intensity. "And I represent a collective that has monitored the Henderson lineage for 3 centuries. We call ourselves the Foundation. We are the architects of the silence that surrounds places like Blackwood Manor." Arthur didn't lower his mug. He felt the weight of the brass bird's claw in his pocket, a cold reminder of the night's terrors. "You're a bit late for the party, Mr. Sterling. The silence was broken hours ago. Julian Thorne is in a cage, and the police are on their way." Sterling smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "The local police will find a very different scene when they arrive, Mr. Vance." They will find a tragic accident involving a landslide and a very unfortunate electrical fire. Julian Thorne will not be speaking to anyone. Neither will his closer. Lydia. We've already managed the situation. Thomas Henderson's hand shook as he reached for the ledger. You've managed it. My family has been paying your foundation for protection for generations. And yet, I was nearly drowned in my own cave. Protection is a relative term. Thomas. Sterling replied smoothly. We protect the legacy, not the individuals. The house required a transition. It was hungry, as your housekeeper so colorfully put it. But it seems Mr. Vance here has disrupted the natural order. By saving you, Arthur, you've essentially volunteered to take the house's attention upon yourself. Arthur looked down at the ledger. His name was still there, the ink appearing darker, almost wet. I'm not a big believer in haunted houses or natural orders. Sterling. I'm an investigator. I follow facts. And the fact is, you're here for this book. The ledger is not just a book. Sterling said, his voice dropping an octave. It is a focal point. Blackwood sits on a unique geological intersection, a place where the membrane between the physical and the other is thin. The ledger records the debt of the land. Every name in that book represents a life given to keep that membrane intact. Sterling opened his silver briefcase. Inside, nestled in black foam, was a collection of instruments that looked like a cross between surgical tools and Victorian alchemy equipment. He pulled out a small, glass vial filled with a shimmering, mercury-like liquid. I have a proposal for you, Mr. Vance. Sterling continued. Give us the ledger. Leave Blackwood and never look back. In exchange, we will use our resources to redact your name. You can go back to your quiet life of finding lost cats and cheating spouses. And if I don't? Arthur asked, his wit returning. Do I get a complimentary stay in the West Wing until the house finishes its meal? Sterling didn't laugh. If you don't, you will find that the thirst of this house follows you. You will hear the scratching in the walls of every hotel you sleep in. You will feel the cold draft in the middle of summer. Your name is written. Arthur. You can't simply wash it away with soap. Arthur looked at the shimmering mercury-like liquid in the vial. It moved with a life of its own, swirling against the glass as if trying to find a way out. He had seen many things in his career, corrupt politicians, brilliant thieves, and desperate killers. But he had never seen a substance that seemed to defy the laws of gravity and light. You speak of membranes and geological intersections like a man who has spent too much time in a basement reading science fiction. Sterling. Arthur said, leaning back. But I'm a man of evidence. If Blackwood is so special, show me why. Otherwise, this is just a very expensive bottle of poison. Sterling didn't blink. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a translucent map. It wasn't a standard paper map. It looked like it was made of thin, layered plastic. When he laid it over the kitchen table, the lines on the map began to glow with a faint, pulsing blue light. This is a map of the Earth's telluric currents. Sterling explained, pointing to a spot where 7 jagged lines converged in a violent knot. Most people call them ley lines. In some places, they flow smoothly. In others, they collide. Blackwood Manor was built directly over a vortex point. The Hendersons didn't just build a house, they built a lid on a pressure cooker. The foundation's findings. The sinkhole effect. The manor acts as a psychic drain, pulling in negative energy from the surrounding miles. Temporal distortion. Time within the bird's path and the lower vaults does not always move at a 1-to-1 ratio with the outside world. The ledger's role. The iron ledger acts as a grounding wire. By writing a name in it, the house earmarked a soul to stabilize the energy for another cycle. Your name is there because you were the catalyst for the cycle's failure. Sterling continued. By preventing Thomas's death, you left the house hungry. It chose you as the replacement. If you walk away now without our help, you will become a magnet for every anomaly this earth has to offer. Thomas Henderson looked at the map, his face pale. My grandfather always said the West Wing was heavy. He forbade us from entering the sub-basement. He said the walls there were made of living stone. It's not living, Thomas. Sterling corrected. It's reactive. And right now, it's reacting to Mr. Vance. Suddenly, a low, vibrating hum began to emanate from the floorboards. It wasn't the sound of the wind or the pipes. It was a deep, subsonic frequency that made Arthur's teeth ache. The silver liquid in Sterling's vial began to thrash violently. The West Wing. Mrs. Gable whispered, her eyes fixed on the kitchen door. It's waking up. It knows the ledger is out of the vault. Arthur stood up, grabbing the iron ledger and tucking it firmly under his arm. He looked at Sterling, then at the terrified Thomas. I'm not giving you the book, Sterling. If my name is on the guest list for this thirst, I'd rather have the menu in my hand than trust a man in a grey suit to read it to me. You are making a grave mistake, Arthur, Sterling said, his voice remaining eerily calm as the humming grew louder. You cannot investigate a force of nature. Watch me. Arthur replied. He turned to Thomas. Where is the entrance to the West Wing sub-basement? If the house wants me, I might as well introduce myself. Thomas Henderson pointed a shaking finger toward the far end of the Great Hall. The West Wing has been sealed since my grandfather's funeral in 1964. He told my father that some doors are not meant to be opened, even by the people who own the keys. The entrance to the sub-basement is behind the tapestry of the Hunt of the Stag in the gallery. Arthur didn't hesitate. He grabbed his heavy leather coat and checked his pockets. The brass bird's claw was still there, cold and heavy. Sterling stood up, his silver briefcase snapping shut. If you insist on this suicide mission, Mr. Vance, at least allow me to observe. Sterling said. The Foundation prefers to document the consumption of its subjects. It helps us calibrate the stabilization formulas for the next site. Follow if you like, Sterling, but stay out of my way. Arthur replied. I don't like being a case study. They moved through the manor, the air growing colder with every step toward the West Wing. Here, the wallpaper was peeling in long, jagged strips that looked like dead skin. The humming vibration was so strong now that the dust on the floor was dancing in geometric patterns. Cymatic shapes that looked like jagged, interlocking teeth. The West Wing observations. Static charge. Arthur's hair stood on end. Every metal door handle gave a sharp, blue spark. Acoustic shadow. The sounds of the storm outside vanished completely, replaced by a low, rhythmic thumping, like a massive, slow heartbeat. Visual distortions. The edges of the hallway seemed to blur and stretch, making the corridor look miles long. They reached the Hunt of the Stag tapestry. It was a massive, moth-eaten thing showing a white stag being cornered by hounds with eyes like burning coals. Arthur pulled the heavy fabric aside. Behind it was not a stone wall, but a door made of solid, unpolished obsidian. There were no hinges and no visible handle. In the center of the dark stone was a single, circular hole. The bird's claw. Thomas whispered, standing a safe distance away. It's not just for the sea cave. It's the key to the heart of the pressure cooker. Arthur pressed the brass claw into the hole. The obsidian didn't move. It dissolved. The stone turned into a thick, black smoke that swirled into the floor, revealing a staircase that spiraled down into a darkness so deep it seemed to drink the light from Arthur's flashlight. The telluric intersection is approximately 40 meters below this point. Sterling remarked, checking a small device on his wrist. The pressure at the vortex point can be measured by the formula. At this depth, the physics of Blackwood become, let's say, subjective. Arthur stepped onto the first stair. It wasn't made of stone. It felt like compressed glass, smooth and unnervingly warm. As he descended, the iron ledger under his arm began to vibrate. The pages started flipping on their own, the names of the eaten souls whispering as the wind whistled through the paper. "Vance!" Thomas called out from the doorway. "If you don't come back in an hour, I'm burning this house to the ground. Give me 2 hours. Thomas." Arthur's voice echoed from the dark. "I have a lot of questions for the landlord." The obsidian stairs didn't end so much as they dissolved into a floor of pure, translucent quartz. Arthur's flashlight beam didn't bounce off the walls anymore. It bent. The light curved in a slow arc, swirling toward the center of the massive, circular vault they had entered. At the heart of the room was a sphere of pulsing, violet light. It wasn't a solid object, but a tear in the fabric of the space itself. It hummed with a frequency that vibrated in Arthur's marrow, a sound that felt like 1,000 voices whispering the same word in a language that predated human speech. "The singularity," Sterling whispered, his voice stripped of its boardroom confidence. He held up a device that was frantically spinning. "We are currently at the nexus of the 7 telluric currents. The gravitational constant is fluctuating. If we stay too long, the temporal dilation will become permanent." Arthur looked down at the iron ledger. The book was nearly white-hot now. The names on the pages were no longer static ink. They were moving, flowing toward the center of the room like iron filings to a magnet. He saw the names of previous Hendersons, forgotten servants, and travelers who had vanished in the fog. And then, there was his name, Arthur Vance. It was pulsing in time with the violet sphere. "The house isn't just thirsty. Sterling," Arthur said, shielding his eyes from the glare. "It's a battery. A biological and geological battery that needs a conscious observer to maintain its coherence. The Eaten aren't dead. They're being used as anchors to keep this hole from expanding." The physics of the vortex. Event horizon. The violet sphere acts as a localized Schwarzschild radius. Temporal shift. For every minute spent in the vault, approximately 10 minutes pass in the manner above. The formula of entrapment. Sterling pointed to his screen, which displayed the calculation for proper time detaching from coordinate time. The deeper you go into the ledger's influence, Arthur, the more your proper time detaches from the world's coordinate time. You think by giving it my name, I become the new anchor? Arthur asked, stepping closer to the sphere. The wind in the room was picking up, pulling at his coat, pulling at the book. "Precisely," Sterling replied. "The Foundation has calculated that a mind as sharp as yours, trained in logic and observation, could stabilize this point for at least 70 years. It's a noble sacrifice. In a way, you save the village. You save the Hendersons." "I've never been much for nobility, Sterling," Arthur muttered. "I'm more of a find the exit kind of guy." Arthur looked at the brass bird's claw. He realized it wasn't just a key to open the door. It was a conductor. He remembered the sea cave and the way the water moved when he diverted the tide. If this was a pressure cooker, he didn't need to stay inside to hold the lid down. He needed to blow the safety valve. He looked at the map in the ledger. There was a final, faint line leading through the sphere, toward a point labeled the void's breath. "Sterling, if your membrane is so thin here, what happens if I introduce a foreign element into the circuit?" Arthur asked, his thumb hovering over the page with his name. "It would cause a localized collapse," Sterling warned, taking a step back toward the stairs. "A total inversion of the telluric flow. The house would be destroyed. We would be destroyed. Better a pile of rubble than a pantry for a hungry ghost," Arthur said. He didn't hand over the book. Instead, he tore the page with his own name out of the ledger and wrapped it around the brass bird's claw. "Arthur, stop." Sterling's voice lost its icy composure, cracking into a jagged, desperate shout. He reached for his silver briefcase, but the gravitational fluctuations were now so severe that the heavy metal box floated upward, spinning like a top. "You are destroying a data point 3 centuries in the making. The Foundation will not allow a total systemic collapse. The Foundation can file a complaint with the rubble." Arthur replied. He felt the brass bird's claw heating up in his palm, the paper wrapped around it glowing with a pale, ghostly light. He stepped to the very edge of the quartz floor, where the violet sphere pulsed with a terrifying, rhythmic intensity. The wind was a literal scream now, a vacuum pulling at his very soul. He looked at the sphere, not as a ghost or a god, but as a faulty piece of engineering. "If this is a battery," Arthur yelled over the roar, "it's time for a short circuit." He hurled the brass claw directly into the center of the violet light. The moment the metal and the paper, the witness and the key, touched the singularity, the sound stopped. For a heartbeat, there was a silence so absolute it felt like being deaf. Then, the violet light turned a blinding, architectural white. The mechanics of the collapse. The introduction of the witness and the conductor into the telluric nexus created a feedback loop, using the principles of destructive interference. The energy wasn't destroyed, it was folded back into the earth. The localized Schwarzschild radius began to contract at an exponential rate. "It's inverting," Sterling screamed, though Arthur could only see the man's mouth moving. The quartz floor beneath them began to shatter into a million glowing shards. The walls of the vault, the living stone of the West Wing, started to liquefy, turning into a dark, viscous sludge that flowed upward toward the manor. The pressure in Arthur's ears was immense, a crushing weight that threatened to pop his skull. He didn't wait to see Sterling's fate. He turned and scrambled for the obsidian stairs. But the stairs were no longer there. The spiraling path had straightened into a vertical shaft of light. Arthur grabbed a protruding iron pipe, part of the ancient plumbing or perhaps the bird's path mechanism, and hauled himself up. Above him, he could hear the manor itself groaning, the sound of thousand-year-old oak and Victorian brick being twisted by a force it was never meant to contain. The light from below was chasing him, a white fire that didn't burn but seemed to erase everything it touched. He climbed with a feral intensity, his lungs burning, his fingers bleeding. He reached the obsidian doorway just as the tapestry of the Hunt of the Stag burst into flames. He tumbled into the great hall, gasping for air that didn't taste like ozone. Behind him, the West Wing was silent. The humming had stopped. The vibration was gone. Arthur looked back. The obsidian door was gone. In its place was a wall of smooth, featureless limestone. The West Wing hadn't been destroyed by fire or explosion. It had been omitted. It was simply no longer a part of the house. Arthur lay on the cold marble of the great hall, his chest heaving. The air in the manor had changed. It no longer felt heavy or electric. It felt thin, like the air at the top of a mountain. For the first time since he had crossed the bridge into the village, the house was truly silent. The thirst that had defined Blackwood for 3 centuries had been replaced by a hollow, ringing void. He sat up slowly, wincing as his bruised ribs protested. He looked at the wall where the West Wing entrance had been. It was perfectly smooth, the limestone cool to the touch. There were no seams, no dust, and no smell of smoke. It was as if that entire section of the manor had been surgically removed from the timeline. "Mr. Vance." The voice was shaky. Arthur turned to see Thomas Henderson standing at the top of the stairs, clutching the railing. Behind him, Mrs. Gable stood with a crucifix pressed to her lips. They looked down at the empty space where a wing of their home used to be. "It's gone, Thomas," Arthur said, his voice raspy. "The vortex, The singularity. The whole damn pressure cooker. I blew the valve. Thomas descended the stairs with a slow, mechanical gait. He walked to the limestone wall and pressed his palm against it. He closed his eyes, his face twisting in a mix of grief and relief. The weight. It's gone. I can't hear the scratching anymore. For 60 years. I've heard the scratching. It's finally quiet. The immediate aftermath. The ledger. Arthur reached into his coat and pulled out the iron ledger. The metal binding was no longer rusted. It was a dull, matte grey. He flipped to the back. The pages were blank. Every name, from the 1700s to the present, had vanished. The debt was settled. The environment. The temperature in the hall had stabilized to a normal 18 degrees Celsius. The acoustic shadow was gone. Arthur could hear the distant sound of a bird chirping outside. Sterling. There was no sign of the man in the grey suit. Whether he had been pulled into the inversion or had fled into the shadows of their omission was a mystery Arthur wasn't sure he wanted to solve. Where is the man from the Foundation? Mrs. Gable asked, her eyes darting toward the dark corners of the ceiling. He went with the data. Arthur replied grimly. He wanted to document the end. I think he got exactly what he wanted. Arthur stood up, using the ledger as a makeshift cane. He walked toward the front doors, which were still slightly ajar. The lavender dawn had turned into a bright, crisp morning. The storm had washed the world clean. But as Arthur looked down the long, winding driveway, he saw something that made his heart sink. 3 black SUVs were navigating the mud, driving with a military precision that didn't suggest local law enforcement. They weren't displaying any logos, but Arthur recognized the antenna arrays on the roofs. It was a resolution team from the Foundation. Thomas, get Mrs. Gable and Elena. Arthur commanded, his investigator instincts kicking back into gear. Go to the gardener's cottage. Stay off the main paths. The people coming up that driveway aren't here to help with the insurance claim. But the house is safe now. Thomas protested. The house is a crime scene in a reality that no longer exists. Arthur said, handing him the now blank ledger. And you're the only witness who can prove it was ever there. Go. Now. Arthur watched them disappear through the back servant's entrance. He checked his watch. He had approximately 3 minutes before the Foundation arrived to manage the silence. He looked at the limestone wall one last time, wondering if Sterling was watching from the other side of the void. The 3 black SUVs screeched to a synchronized halt on the gravel circle, their tires kicking up a spray of muddy water. Before the engines had even cut out, doors flew open and 6 men in matte black tactical gear stepped out. They weren't carrying standard rifles. They held wide-barreled projectors that looked like a cross between a riot gun and a high-end camera. Behind them came a woman in a sharp, charcoal grey suit. Her hair pulled back into a bun so tight it seemed to pull the skin of her forehead. Arthur leaned against the door frame, crossing his arms. He looked like a man waiting for a bus, despite the fact that half of the house behind him had literally vanished from existence. The woman approached the porch. She didn't look at the gardens or the beautiful sunrise. Her eyes were fixed on the limestone wall visible through the open front doors. She stopped 3 paces from Arthur, pulling a tablet from her inner pocket. "Mr. Vance," she said. Her voice was like a glacier grinding against a mountain, slow, cold, and unstoppable. "I am Director Halloway. We've been tracking the chronometric signatures of this site for the last 40 minutes. Where is Agent Sterling?" Sterling decided to stay behind, Arthur said, tilting his head toward the house. "He was very dedicated to the data. I think he's currently part of their mission in the West Wing." Halloway didn't flinch. She stepped past Arthur into the Great Hall, her team following her with their sensors humming. One of the technicians pointed a device at the limestone wall. A holographic display flickered to life, showing a jagged red line that flatlined the moment it touched the stone. The ontological damping is absolute. The technician reported. The probability of the west wing existing in this coordinate set is now. The telluric flux has been redirected into a closed-loop system. You used the ledger, didn't you? Holloway turned back to Arthur, her sharp eyes boring into his. The Foundation spent 60 years calculating the exact moment for a controlled extraction. You turned a delicate surgical procedure into a demolition. I'm an investigator, not a surgeon. Arthur replied. The house was hungry, and I wasn't on the menu. If you wanted a controlled extraction, you should have sent someone more competent than a man who hides behind a silver briefcase. Holloway stepped closer, the smell of ozone and expensive perfume clinging to her. Where is the iron ledger? Arthur. That book is property of the Foundation by right of the 1742 Accord. Without it, the stabilization of the remaining structure is impossible. The thirst will eventually leak out of that wall. Arthur reached into his coat and pulled out the blank, grey-bound book. He tossed it to her. She caught it with one hand, her thumb flicking through the pages. Her face, for the first time, showed a flicker of genuine shock. It's empty. She whispered. The debt was paid in full. Arthur said. The names are gone. The anchors are gone. The Hendersons are just a family with a very strange architectural problem now. If you want to study the thirst, you'll have to find a new battery. Holloway handed the book to her technician without looking away from Arthur. You don't understand the scale of what you've done. By blanking that ledger, you've blinded us to every other site on this meridian. You've created a blind spot in the global reality grid. Maybe the world could use a few more blind spots. Arthur said. Prevents people like you from looking too closely at things that don't belong to them. Holloway stared at him for a long beat. You're a dangerous variable. Mr. Vance. Sterling's report mentioned your name was written in the book. If you're still standing here, it means you've successfully redacted yourself from the telluric stream. She signaled to her team. They began setting up silver pylons around the limestone wall, containment units meant to keep the void from spreading. We're taking the house, Holloway said. By order of the Ministry of Internal Stability. You have 10 minutes to clear your belongings and leave the property. If you ever speak of Blackwood, or the Bird's Path, or the Foundation, well, let's just say we have other books. Books that don't blank out so easily. Arthur didn't argue with Holloway. He knew a losing hand when he saw one, and standing in the middle of a resolution team with nothing but a dry cleaning bill and a bruised ego was the definition of a bad bet. He turned away from the limestone wall and began the long climb to the third floor. The stairs felt different. Every step produced a hollow, metallic ring that vibrated up his shins. The thinness he had felt in the great hall was even more pronounced here. The air tasted like copper and ozone, a sharp, sterile tang that made his lungs feel like they were being scrubbed with wire wool. When he reached his room, he found the door hanging off its hinges, a reminder of Victor's earlier rage. He stepped inside and stopped. The room was perfectly still, but the light was wrong. The sunlight streaming through the window didn't fall on the floor in straight lines. It curved slightly toward the center of the bed, as if the gravity in the room was being gently tugged by an invisible string. Arthur grabbed his weathered leather suitcase and began throwing his few belongings inside. His spare shirts, his shaving kit, and his notebook. As he reached for his flask on the nightstand, he saw his reflection in the small, silver-framed mirror he had used that morning. He froze. His reflection wasn't solid. Around the edges of his silhouette, there was a faint, iridescent shimmer, like oil on water. When he moved his hand, the reflection followed with a microsecond delay. He wasn't just redacted from the ledger. He was partially detached from the standard frequency of the world. The effects of the redaction. Temporal lag. Arthur's physical presence was operating at a slight phase shift from the surrounding environment. Optical distortion. Light passing through his immediate vicinity was subject to a minor refractive index change. Sensory heightening. He could hear the hum of the foundation's pylons 2 floors below, as if they were right next to his ear. It seems the short circuit left a mark. Mr. Vance. A voice said from the doorway. Arthur didn't jump. His heightened senses had picked up the guard's heartbeat long before he spoke. He turned to see a Foundation operative in tactical gear, his face hidden behind a darkened visor. The man was holding a device that looked like a high-tech Geiger counter. It was clicking rapidly as it pointed at Arthur. "Director Holloway wants you out in 5 minutes." The guard said, his voice distorted by a comlink. "Your signature is spiking. You're becoming an environmental hazard." "I'm just packing my socks, officer," Arthur said, regaining his wit despite the shimmering in his vision. Hardly a level 5 catastrophe. He reached for his coat, but his hand brushed against a small object on the nightstand that hadn't been there before. It was a heavy silver coin, stamped with the bird with clipped wings. On the back, etched in tiny, precise letters, was a single word: redacted. Arthur slipped the coin into his pocket. It felt incredibly heavy, heavier than a piece of silver that size should be. It felt like a tether. "I'm done," Arthur said, snapping his suitcase shut. He walked past the guard. As he did, the man's visor flickered, the electronics struggling to resolve Arthur's image. Arthur didn't look back. He headed for the back stairs, intending to skirt the main hall and meet the Hendersons at the cottage. He had a feeling that while the Foundation was busy with the limestone wall, they wouldn't notice a shimmering man slipping through the garden. Arthur slipped out of the servants' entrance, the heavy leather suitcase feeling lighter than usual in his shimmering grip. The morning fog had returned, thick and clinging, as if the manor were trying to hide its shame from the rising sun. Every time Arthur stepped onto the grass, the blades didn't just bend, they turned a translucent, frosted white before snapping back to green a second later. He moved toward the gardener's cottage, keeping to the shadows of the ancient yew trees. His senses were so sharp now that he could hear the internal hum of the Foundation's SUVs from across the estate. It wasn't just sound, it was a frequency, a jagged saw blade of noise that cut through the silence of the woods. When he reached the cottage, he didn't knock. He simply turned the handle. The door swung open to reveal Thomas Henderson, Elena, and Mrs. Gable huddled around a small battery-operated radio. As Arthur stepped into the room, the radio began to emit a screeching burst of static. "Mr. Vance," Elena gasped, standing up so quickly her chair nearly toppled. She stared at him, her eyes wide. Your face. It looks like it's behind a sheet of falling water." "A side effect of the West Wing's closing sale," Arthur said, setting his suitcase down. The floorboards groaned beneath it, though it barely contained any weight. He looked at Thomas. "The Foundation is sealing the house. Holloway thinks she has everything under control, but I suspect the thirst isn't as contained as she likes to think." Arthur pulled the silver redacted coin from his pocket. The moment it touched the air, the static on the radio formed a rhythmic, pulsing pattern. The physics of the phase shift. The shimmer Arthur was experiencing was a direct result of destructive interference with the local reality grid. His physical form was now oscillating at a slightly different frequency than the ground he stood on. This can be modeled by the superposition of two wave functions, where the phase difference $/delta$ was no longer constant, causing a visible beat in his physical coherence. "That coin," Thomas whispered, leaning forward. "My father had one. He kept it in a lead-lined box in the safe. He called it a silent king's ransom. He said if the house ever stopped breathing, The coin would tell us where the heart went. Where the heart went? Arthur asked, rubbing the heavy silver surface. The heart is a hole in the ground now, Thomas. I saw it invert. No. Thomas shook his head. The vortex was just the engine. The heart of Blackwood isn't a place. It's a person. Every 50 years. The Foundation doesn't just stabilize the site. They harvest the anchor. Arthur looked at the shimmering outline of his own hand. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Holloway hadn't been angry that he destroyed the West Wing. She was angry that he had inadvertently turned himself into the new, mobile anchor. The coin wasn't a gift or a memento. It was a tracking device. Suddenly, the static on the radio stopped. A clear, calm voice came through the speakers. It was Director Holloway, speaking on a private Foundation channel that the old radio shouldn't have been able to pick up. Subject Vance has reached the cottage. She said. The signal is localized. Deploy the containment field. We cannot allow the anchor to leave the perimeter. Arthur looked at the window. The fog was turning a dark, bruised purple. The Foundation wasn't just coming to talk. They were coming to harvest. The purple fog wasn't just a weather phenomenon. It was a physical weight. As it pressed against the windows of the gardener's cottage, the glass began to hum, vibrating at a frequency that made the water in Mrs. Gable's tea set dance in perfect, concentric circles. Arthur looked at the perimeter through the gaps in the wooden shutters. The Foundation hadn't just surrounded them. They had rewritten the local laws of physics. It's a chronometric damping field, Arthur said, his voice echoing with a strange, metallic reverb. They're slowing down the passage of time within the fog to trap their anchor, which, unfortunately, is me. He could see the shimmer spreading. It wasn't just his reflection anymore. The very air around his hands was beginning to crackle with tiny, microscopic fractures in the light. To his heightened senses, the world looked like a poorly tuned television screen. He could see the ghosting of objects, where the cottage was, and where it was a second ago. The mechanics of the damping field. The Foundation's pylons were emitting a high-energy pulse designed to lock the local reality grid into a static state. Arthur's subjective time slowed relative to the Foundation's observers, making him an easy target for extraction. Silas, the gardener. Thomas whispered, his eyes darting to a heavy iron ring set into the floorboards beneath the rug. He didn't just grow roses, Mr. Vance. He was a grounder. He helped my grandfather maintain the seals. This cottage sits on a lead-lined Faraday cellar. It was built to shield the grounders from the house's thirst. Lead-lined. Arthur's eyes sharpened. That might be enough to break the tether of this coin. He grabbed the iron ring and pulled. The floorboards groaned, revealing a narrow, stone-lined ladder leading into a dark, cramped space that smelled intensely of dry earth and old batteries. Everyone, get down there, Arthur commanded. If the field hits the cottage fully, you'll be frozen in a single moment of time for whoever knows how long. I'll follow, but I need to tune this coin first. As Elena and Mrs. Gable scrambled down the ladder, Arthur stood in the center of the room. He held the redacted coin up to the purple light filtering through the shutters. The silver surface began to glow, the bird's wings appearing to flap as the temporal pressure mounted. Suddenly, the front door of the cottage didn't just open, it erased. The wood vanished into a flurry of white pixels, and Director Holloway stepped into the room. She wasn't wearing tactical gear. She wore a specialized phase suit that pulsed with a steady, stabilizing blue light, allowing her to move normally within the slowed-down time of the field. The Faraday cellar is a clever trick, Arthur, she said, her voice sounding like it was being played in slow motion. But you can't ground a storm of this magnitude. Give me the coin and step into the containment unit. We can't have the anchor wandering the countryside, causing reality glitches in the village. Arthur grinned, his teeth shimmering like pearls under a blacklight. "I've always preferred the scenic route. Director." He didn't head for the cellar. Instead, he lunged toward the window, the coin clutched tight in his hand. Arthur's shoulder hit the window frame with a crunch that sounded like a slow-motion explosion. Because of the chronometric damping field, the glass didn't shatter and fall. It splintered into thousands of razor-sharp diamonds that hung suspended in the thick, purple air. Arthur moved through them, his shimmering body slipping between the frozen shards like a ghost through a graveyard of light. As he tumbled onto the grass, the sensation was like hitting a wall of cold jelly. The outside world was moving at a fraction of its normal speed. A raindrop, caught in the field, sat motionless a few inches from his nose, vibrating with a tiny, trapped energy. "Capture team, move in." Holloway's voice drifted through the fog, distorted and deep, as if she was speaking from the bottom of a well. His phase shifting. "Increase the pylon output to 9 gigahertz. Arthur scrambled to his feet. He could see the Foundation operatives moving toward him. Their blue phase suits allowed them to bypass the temporal lag, making them look like blurring streaks of cerulean light against the static purple backdrop. To them, Arthur was likely moving in slow motion, but to Arthur, his own heart was beating a frantic, shimmering rhythm that defied the field's grip. The subjective velocity constant. Arthur realized that his redacted status meant he wasn't bound by the standard temporal coordinates. His movement through the field could be described by the subjective velocity formula. Because his index was spiking, his velocity was technically approaching an undefined limit relative to the frozen world around him. You can't outrun a fundamental constant. "Vance!" one of the operatives shouted, leveling a wide-barreled projector at him. A beam of white, tethering light shot out from the weapon. Arthur felt it catch his shimmering sleeve. The weight was immense. It felt as if someone had tied a lead weight to his soul. The shimmer around his arm began to pulse a violent, angry red. He looked at the silver redacted coin in his hand. It was vibrating so hard it was blurring into a sphere. "If I'm the tuning fork," Arthur muttered, his breath coming out as a cloud of frozen crystals. "Then it's time to change the station." He slammed the coin against the iron hilt of the gardener's spade, which was stuck in the frozen mud nearby. The sound wasn't a noise. It was a ripple in reality. A shockwave of pure, discordant frequency erupted from the point of impact. The purple fog shattered. The suspended raindrops disintegrated into mist. The capture pylons around the perimeter began to glow white-hot before melting into puddles of slag. Arthur felt the tether on his arm snap. The sudden release of tension sent him sprawling across the lawn, which was no longer purple, but the dull, wet green of a normal morning. The chronometric damping field had collapsed. He didn't wait to see Holloway's reaction. He knew the collapse was only temporary. He sprinted toward the woods, his body still shimmering but his feet finally hitting the ground with the solid, rhythmic motion of a man who was very much alive, even if he was no longer entirely there. The edge of the Blackwood woods swallowed Arthur whole. Here, the trees weren't just old. They were ancient sentinels that had watched the thirst of the manor for centuries. Their roots twisted through the soil like the veins of a giant, sleeping beast. Because of Arthur's phase shift, the forest didn't look like a collection of bark and leaves. It looked like a pulsing network of emerald and gold light, every living thing vibrating with a frequency that his new senses could finally hear. Arthur leaned against a massive yew tree, his breath coming in ragged, shimmering gasps. Every time he exhaled, the air didn't just mist. It formed tiny, geometric frost patterns that hung in the air for several seconds before dissolving. He was no longer just an investigator. He was a walking anomaly, a glitch in the world's source code. The mechanics of the grove. The ancient yews acted as natural grounders. Their deep root systems tapped into the telluric currents that Arthur had inverted, creating a zone of high-density reality. The anchoring effect. Within the grove, Arthur's shimmer felt more solid. The phase shift was dampened by the sheer biological mass of the trees. The detection probability. As the Foundation approached, Arthur calculated his risk. The probability of him being detected by their phase scanners was modeled by the formula. "They're coming, Arthur," a voice whispered from the canopy above. Arthur looked up. Perched on a thick branch was Silas, the gardener. But Silas didn't look like the tired old man from the porch. In Arthur's shifted vision, Silas glowed with a steady, deep brown light, the color of rich earth and ancient stone. "The Foundation has phase stalkers now," Silas said, dropping down to the forest floor with surprising grace. "Men who have been modified to breathe in the same frequency as the anchor. They don't need pylons to see you. They just need to smell the ozone you're leaking." "How do I stop the leaking, Silas?" Arthur asked, clutching the redacted coin. "I'm a detective, not a human power plant. I need to get back to being a man who just has a very expensive dry cleaning bill." Silas walked toward him, his hand reaching out. When he touched Arthur's arm, the shimmer didn't hurt. It felt like a warm, grounding circuit. "You can't go back, Arthur. The redaction is permanent. But you can learn to tune the dial. If you want to disappear from Halloway's map, you have to stop fighting the house's mark and start wearing it like a coat." Suddenly, the sound of breaking branches echoed from the direction of the manor. It wasn't the heavy, clunky sound of tactical boots. It was a high-pitched, metallic whine, like a knife being dragged across glass. "Phase stalkers," Silas hissed. 3 figures emerged from the fog. They weren't wearing the blue suits of the capture team. They wore translucent, liquid metal armor that rippled like quicksilver. Their faces were smooth, featureless masks of polished chrome. They didn't walk, they glided, their forms blurring in and out of existence as they synchronized their heartbeats to the shimmering rhythm of Arthur's own chest. Arthur gripped the coin. He felt the cold weight of the thirst returning. But this time, it wasn't trying to eat him. It was waiting for a command. The 3 phase stalkers didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their liquid metal suits hummed in a perfect, terrifying unison, creating a localized field of static reality that felt like a wall of cold glass pressing against Arthur's shimmering skin. As they glided forward, the grass beneath their feet didn't just frost. It shattered into subatomic dust. "Don't fight the frequency, Arthur," Silas hissed, his voice sounding like the rustle of dry leaves. "If you push against them, you're just a solid target. You have to become the static." Arthur gripped the redacted coin so hard the silver edges bit into his palm. He could feel the stalker's presence not as a sight, but as a pressure in his inner ear. They were tuning themselves to him, searching for the exact oscillation of his heartbeat to lock him into a physical anchor. The physics of the stalker lock. The phase stalkers utilized a triple-node synchronization. By surrounding Arthur, they created a triangular interference pattern. The lead stalker raised a hand. The liquid metal on his forearm shifted, forming a serrated blade that vibrated so fast it was nearly invisible. It hummed with a pitch that made Arthur's vision blur into a kaleidoscope of emerald and violet. "Vance." The stalker's voice came through a vocal synthesizer, sounding like grinding tectonic plates. "You are an unregistered anomaly. Compliance is the only path to stabilization." "I've never been much for compliance," Arthur gasped. He closed his eyes, leaning into the sensation of the ancient yew tree behind him. He stopped trying to hold his body together. He stopped trying to be Arthur Vance, private investigator. Instead, he let the thirst of the inverted west wing flow through him, using the yew roots as a grounding wire. The shimmer around him didn't fade. It expanded. Suddenly, Arthur wasn't standing in one place. To the stalkers, he became a blur of a dozen different Arthurs, each one a microsecond apart in time. He was a human strobe light, flickering at a frequency their suits couldn't track. "He's overclocking," the second stalker shouted, his chrome mask rippling in confusion. Arthur moved. He didn't run. He folded through the space between the trees. He appeared behind the lead stalker, the silver coin glowing with a blinding, white-hot intensity. He pressed the coin against the stalker's liquid metal shoulder. The reaction was instantaneous. The redacted energy of the coin acted as a virus in the stalker's synchronization loop. The liquid metal began to boil, turning from silver to a chaotic, oily black. The stalker's form began to glitch, his limbs stretching and snapping like a corrupted video file. "The grove is the ground," Silas yelled. "Drive them into the roots." Arthur didn't hesitate. He grabbed the corrupted stalker and shoved him toward the base of the great yew. The moment the liquid metal touched the ancient wood, the tree's natural telluric field acted as a lightning rod. A surge of green energy erupted, and the stalker vanished, not into the void, but into the earth itself, leaving behind nothing but a faint smell of scorched ozone. The other two stalkers hesitated, their chrome masks reflecting the flickering, shimmering ghost of the man they had come to harvest. Arthur stood in the center of the grove, his body now a steady, pulsing glow of emerald light. "Who's next?" Arthur asked, his voice echoing with the power of the house he had destroyed. The remaining two phase stalkers didn't retreat. Instead, they moved toward each other until their liquid metal shoulders touched. In a sickening display of fluid dynamics, their suits began to merge. The chrome surfaces rippled and fused, turning from two distinct humanoids into a single, four-armed monstrosity that pulsed with a dual-tone hum. "They're entangling," Silas warned, his voice tight. "They're doubling their processing power to calculate your variance. If they lock onto you now, Arthur, they'll pull your atoms apart just to see which ones are shimmering." Arthur felt the shift in the air. The static reality wall was no longer a flat plane. It was becoming a sphere, closing in on him from all sides. The dual stalkers' masks had merged into a single, wide visor that glowed with a predatory red light. It was no longer looking for Arthur's heartbeat. It was looking for his probability. The calculus of non-local presence. The merged stalker was utilizing a Bell's inequality sweep. By measuring 2 points in space-time simultaneously, it could trap Arthur regardless of which flicker he inhabited. "They think I'm a math problem," Arthur muttered, his hands glowing a bright, frantic emerald. "But I've always been terrible at long division." Arthur didn't run away from the monstrosity. He ran toward it. But as he moved, he didn't just flicker. He began to rotate his own phase. He used the redacted coin as a prism, holding it up so the emerald light from the yew trees passed through the silver bird. The result was a phase refraction. Instead of one Arthur or 12 flickers, the grove was suddenly filled with 100 overlapping ghosts of Arthur Vance, all moving in different directions, all repeating different actions. Some were lighting a cigarette, some were checking their watch, some were lunging with the coin. Which one is the real one? The stalker monstrosity growled, its 4 arms swinging wildly through the ghosts. Each time a blade passed through a refraction, the air let out a high-pitched ping, but the blades met no resistance. None of them. Arthur's voice echoed from every direction at once. And all of them. Arthur, the true Arthur, if such a thing still existed, was crouched low beneath the roots of the great yew. He wasn't moving. He was becoming as still as the stone foundations of Blackwood. He was using the refraction as a decoy, a massive surge of noise to hide his own signal. He watched as the merged stalker exhausted its processors trying to solve the 100 Arthur puzzle. The liquid metal on its body began to smoke, the red visor flickering as the entanglement operator overheated. "Now, Silas!" Arthur shouted. Silas didn't use a weapon. He simply slammed his palm onto the earth. As a grounder, he didn't need to phase shift. He just needed to open the door. The telluric current he had been holding back surged upward through the U-roots like a subterranean lightning bolt. The emerald light didn't hit the stalker. It hit the refractions. The 100 ghosts of Arthur Vance exploded into a blinding white flash of pure information. The certainty constant lambda didn't just drop. It inverted. The merged stalker let out a digital scream. The liquid metal tore itself apart. The two Foundation agents inside being ejected back into standard reality. They hit the forest floor, their chrome suits shattered and dull, their phase links broken beyond repair. Arthur stepped out from the roots, his shimmer finally calming into a steady, translucent glow. He looked down at the fallen men, then at the silver coin in his hand. The bird on the coin was no longer clipped. Its wings were spread wide, etched in a light that refused to fade. "Holloway isn't going to stop," Silas said, standing beside him. "She's not just after an anchor anymore. You've proven that the redaction can be weaponized. To the Foundation, you're not a patient, you're a blueprint." Arthur leaned against the ancient yew, the emerald glow of his skin slowly fading into a rhythmic, translucent pulse. The shimmer was no longer a chaotic glitch. It felt like a second skin, a layer of static that hummed in tune with the forest. Silas stood nearby, his eyes fixed on the distant silhouette of Blackwood Manor, where the Foundation's violet floodlights were carving the sky into jagged geometric slices. "You can't stay in these woods forever, Arthur," Silas said, his voice heavy with the weight of centuries. "The grove is a sanctuary, but Holloway is building a resonance bridge at the village crossing. She's going to broadcast a null signal across the entire valley. It won't just find you. It will erase the frequency you're vibrating on. You'll be nothing but a memory in a file cabinet." Arthur looked at the silver redacted coin. The bird's wings were no longer just etched. They were glowing with a steady, white heat. He realized the coin wasn't just a tracking device or a weapon. It was a tuning fork. "If she's building a bridge," Arthur said, his wit returning despite the exhaustion, "then I suppose I'll have to provide the traffic. Tell me, Silas, how does a grounder stop a broadcast?" "By increasing the Q factor of the receiver," Silas replied, pointing to the coin. "You aren't just an anchor, Arthur. You're a high-resonance cavity. If you can reach the bridge before she synchronizes the null signal, you can feed back the thirst of the house directly into her grid." The physics of the high Q resonance. In physics, the quality factor Q describes how underdamped an oscillator is. Arthur's current state could be modeled as a resonance circuit. To disrupt Holloway's broadcast, he needed to maximize his energy storage relative to his energy loss. By focusing the redacted energy within the silver coin, Arthur could create a Dirac delta peak, an infinitely sharp spike in the frequency spectrum that would shatter any damping field Holloway attempted to overlay. "She has an army, Silas," Arthur noted, checking the shimmering dial of his watch. "And I have a suitcase full of damp shirts and a coin that's currently humming at a C-sharp." "You have more than that," Silas said, reaching into his heavy canvas coat and pulling out a small, lead-lined flask. "You have the old frequency. My grandfather saved this from the 1922 collapse. It's liquid ground. Drink it, and for 10 minutes, your shimmer will become a solid, unstoppable force. You won't be a ghost, you'll be a juggernaut." Arthur took the flask. It felt impossibly cold. He looked toward the village. He could see the black SUVs of the Foundation forming a line at the bridge, their blue phase lights flickering like predatory eyes in the mist. 10 minutes. Arthur whispered. "I've solved murders in less time." "Go," Silas commanded, his form beginning to blend back into the shadows of the U. "The house is gone, Arthur, but the world still needs someone who can see the glitches." Arthur didn't run. He stepped. With the redacted coin leading the way, he folded through the space between the trees, moving toward the bridge at a velocity that blurred the forest into a stream of green fire. He wasn't just investigating a mystery anymore. He was becoming the answer. The village bridge, a centuries-old stone structure that once carried horse-drawn carriages and local mail trucks, had been transformed into something alien. Two massive, skeletal towers of matte black carbon fiber rose from either bank of the Blackwood River, pulsing with a nauseating violet light that made the water below turn a greasy, unnatural grey. This was the resonance bridge, the Foundation's ultimate solution for a redacted variable. Arthur stood at the edge of the forest, the silver redacted coin clutched in his left hand and the lead-lined flask in his right. His body was a frantic strobe light of emerald and white, but as he uncorked the flask and swallowed the liquid ground, the world tilted. The taste was horrific, a mix of cold iron, battery acid, and wet earth. But the effect was instantaneous. The flickering shimmer didn't fade. It solidified. The translucent ghosting of his limbs condensed into a heavy, metallic presence. He felt as if his atoms had been welded into place. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was a juggernaut. The null signal calibration. Director Holloway stood atop the eastern tower, her phase suit glowing a steady, sterile blue. She adjusted a dial on her tablet, and the humming of the towers rose to a bone-shattering scream. They were preparing the null signal, a wave function designed to perfectly cancel out Arthur's existence. He would be erased from the local coordinate system entirely. "You're late, Mr. Vance." Holloway's voice boomed over the intercoms, stripped of all humanity. "The synchronization is at 98%. In 2 minutes, the redaction of Arthur Vance will be completed. You'll be a footnote in a restricted file, and Blackwood will be a flat piece of dirt on a map." "I've always hated footnotes," Arthur growled. His voice didn't just carry through the air. It vibrated through the ground. He stepped onto the bridge. The Foundation guards fired their phase projectors, but the white beams of light splashed harmlessly off his liquid ground armor like water off a rock. Arthur didn't run. He walked with a slow, rhythmic finality. With every step, the stone of the bridge cracked beneath his boots. He held the redacted coin aloft. The silver bird began to scream, a high-frequency whistle that challenged the tower's roar. "You're trying to cancel me out, Holloway," Arthur shouted, the emerald light from his skin bleeding into the silver coin. "But you forgot one thing about resonance. If you hit the right note, the whole bridge falls down." Arthur slammed the coin onto the central keystone of the bridge. The feedback was violent. Because he was grounded, the null signal couldn't erase him. Instead, it hit him and bounced back, amplified by the high-Q resonance of the silver coin. The violet light from the towers turned a brilliant, jagged white. The carbon fiber structures began to twist, the skeletal frames groaning as the thirst of the house, now channeled through Arthur, tore into the Foundation's grid. "The signal is looping," a technician screamed from the base of the tower. "The phase offset is inverting. We're losing the perimeter." Holloway looked down, her face finally reflecting a flicker of genuine terror. The bridge wasn't just shaking. It was beginning to phase shift along with Arthur. The stone was turning to glass, and the glass was turning to light. The resonance bridge didn't just collapse. It unraveled. As the null signal looped back into the Foundation's towers, the violet light turned into a blinding, structural white that ate through the carbon fiber like acid. The screaming of the metal was replaced by a low, rhythmic thrum, the heartbeat of Blackwood Manor, channeled through the silver coin in Arthur's hand. Arthur stood at the center of the bridge, his liquid ground armor glowing with a fierce, emerald intensity. He watched as the eastern tower tilted, its foundations dissolving into the same limestone void that had claimed the west wing. Director Holloway was forced to activate her phase suit's emergency extraction, her form flickering into a series of panicked blue afterimages before she vanished completely from the coordinate set. The final inversion. The total energy of the site reached a point of critical redaction. Using the principles of destructive interference on a planetary scale, The local reality grid reset itself to a null state. The thirst was no longer a hunger. It was a closed loop. The debt of the Henderson family, the greed of Julian Thorne, and the cold calculations of the Foundation were all swallowed by the same paradox Arthur had ignited in the vault. As the last stone of the bridge turned to light and fell into the river, Arthur felt the liquid ground wear off. The heavy, metallic weight in his bones vanished, replaced by the familiar, airy shimmer. He tumbled onto the muddy bank of the river, gasping for air that finally tasted like rain and damp earth instead of battery acid. The SUVs were gone. The towers were gone. Even the mist seemed to have retreated, leaving the valley in a crisp, silent morning. 3 weeks later, Arthur Vance sat in a small, poorly lit diner 3 towns away from the Blackwood ruins. He wore his usual leather coat, though it now had a subtle, iridescent sheen. He was nursing a cup of black coffee, watching the steam rise in a way that defied the standard laws of fluid dynamics, curling into tiny, geometric spirals before vanishing. He pulled a small, silver coin from his pocket and placed it on the counter. The bird's wings were still spread, a permanent record of a flight that shouldn't have been possible. The Hendersons, Thomas, Elena, and Mrs. Gable had relocated to a small cottage on the coast, funded by a charity that the Foundation couldn't legally touch. The manor. Blackwood was now a fenced-off geological anomaly, a flat patch of limestone that reflected the stars more clearly than the sky above. The Foundation. They were still watching, of course. Arthur saw the black sedans in his rearview mirror every few days. But they didn't approach. They knew that to touch the redacted man was to risk the stability of their own reality. "Your change, hun," the waitress said, sliding a few coins onto the counter. She paused, squinting at Arthur's hand. "Is the light in here weird? Your fingers look fuzzy." "Just a trick of the mirrors, Clara," Arthur said, giving her a small, witty tip, a £10 note that shimmered slightly in the fluorescent light. "I've always had a bit of a ghost in my step." Arthur stood up and caught his reflection in the diner's window. He wasn't entirely solid, and he wasn't entirely a ghost. He was something in between, a living glitch, a detective who could walk through the walls of a mystery because he was no longer bound by the house's rules. He stepped out into the night. The thirst was gone, but the world was full of other secrets, other holes in the fabric of the Real. And for a man who didn't officially exist, there was a lot of work to be done.